In this video, we're going to talk about XR design thinking. Now, design thinking is actually quite an established method that has been around for many years, coming out of the Stanford Design School, and it's often applied to innovative product development and making user experiences, if you will. But it's really about a mindset. Building empathy with the users, really focusing on the user, and then everything else will follow. That is really the idea. It's more of a, let's say, more of an approach and a way of thinking than its own kind of method or a set of techniques. It actually is associated with common interaction design and user experience design techniques. At least that's the way I think about it. Now, what I want to accomplish here, though, is that we are porting that knowledge from design thinking and applying it to XR. There's a couple of things that are quite different, for example, when it comes to innovation and problem framing. Because XR is really like this technology that could potentially solve a lot of problems, but it's more like we are throwing that technology at everything. It's like our hammer, as I said previously, our hammer, and now you're trying to find all the nails that you can hit with it. And sometimes you'll be successful, and sometimes you're not. And so design thinking is actually is a specific way of framing a problem by really building empathy with your users. Now, your users will not feel like, oh, I need AR, or no, oh, I need VR. No, AR or VR might be the method or the tool, if not the technology, to potentially solve the problem. Now, I want to be very careful because technology in itself doesn't actually solve any problems, but it might actually be an enabler. And that's how I want us to think about that. So here I'll give you an overview of the design thinking method. In the first step, you'll empathize. You empathize with the users. You're trying everything to find out about their problems, what are their pain points, what is currently working for them, what is currently not working for them. You're getting to learn the context and the setting in which current solutions are applied to really identify shortcomings and gaps and therefore opportunities. And this will help you define the problem. Really, the first few steps, the first 3 steps to be precise, are really about problem framing. They're not so much about solution finding. You're actually trying to understand the problem, not just the symptoms of the problem, but actually the problem. And so there are common techniques there in terms of interviewing and observing and doing focus groups. And there are all kinds of standard, let's say, standard traditional human-computer interaction and user research techniques. And then we are entering the ideation stage. And the ideation stage is usually closely tied with prototyping as well. So ideation really doesn't just happen in your brain or just through discussion. What I'll preach here, more or less, is like that ideation happens through sketching and through storyboarding and through wireframing. So these are some of the common techniques that I really want you to embrace when it comes to the ideation stage. And that then actually helps us transition into prototyping. And so in prototyping, you usually work with paper and building really paper prototypes. I'll show you some examples of this, especially in the XR context. This is really useful. When you have these first prototypes, you can go also from paper to digital, but even just the paper prototypes, you could actually test with users. And keep in mind that the nature of the prototype really also somehow frames the feedback that you will get. So for example, if you have something that looks very low fidelity, initial stage, sketchy if you want, you probably get very different feedback, not so much about the colors, but maybe more about the flow and maybe the organization roughly of your interfaces. And so this is a very important thing to keep in mind. So you don't want your prototypes to look too polished, because it may also, there is this observation that if something looks too finished, it's close to being done, then your testers might be reluctant to provide more feedback because they anticipate a much higher cost involved in making changes. And now that's an interesting aspect as well. And with this testing phase concluded, although testing, to be honest, never really finishes because you go on and implement. Here, when we talk about implementation, I usually think of prototypes as something we're implementing a prototype and we're testing that prototype, and then we're doing potentially another iteration. Here, this idea of implementation, really then you're going to use the technologies. In our case, we would actually go and try things out with XR devices directly. Now, I'll introduce you to methods that allow you to actually use XR devices also in the prototyping and ideation stages even. So for example, through immersive prototyping, where you actually create interfaces directly on an XR device and can test it as you're designing, concurrently testing it as you're designing. And so that is a really, really cool thing that you can do that is almost unique to XR. So now that we have established this 6-step method with the empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, and implement steps, let's look at some of the issues when it comes to XR in each of these steps. Now, as said, a common way to empathize is to interview users and to observe users and understand really their challenges and what are the pain points. Now, the problem with XR is that XR is usually not already a solution. So if you're refining an existing XR prototype, yes, then maybe you can observe how users use it. But if you're looking at an existing problem and you're trying to bring in XR as a potentially new solution, you can't really observe the users directly. It's very different from like web-based and mobile-based design, where we often, the users really work with this technology like on a daily basis. XR is really not like that. I mean, I don't know a lot of people that actually use VR on a daily basis and or AR on a daily basis, and then certainly not to achieve anything productive. I mean, we are moving into meeting scenarios and carrying out meetings in XR, so in AR or VR, but we don't really work yet, at least not yet, in these kinds of virtual spaces with virtual offices. And if we did, then the more traditional techniques of observation, interviewing, and really like shadowing and doing kind of like field studies. But the reality here at the moment is that you cannot really observe the issues directly as they happen with XR. So in the definition phase, to me, it's very important that you don't just look at the problem or don't just look at the symptoms of the problem and then trying to, whatever it takes to, to press that problem into an AR or VR solution. Many of us have a preference. So somebody maybe likes VR more than AR, and then they're trying to solve everything with VR or solve everything with AR. For me, it's very important that we keep an open mind. So don't just commit to AR or VR. It might very well be that after going through these initial kind of need-finding strategies, that you figure out that neither AR nor VR is actually a solution. And that would actually be a very good result. It could avoid a lot of cost and save you a lot of time and energy. So as we are moving into the ideation stage, what is very, very important to me here, and I really say this to my students all the time, is that when you ideate and you already have like experience, for example, using devices like HoloLens, and you know of all the technical limitations of these devices, so for example, the frequency with which they scan the environment, although that can be configured, or the accuracy with which they can represent the environment, or the lack of semantics that we have. So it's really hard to detect objects reliably, objects we've never seen before, and then know that the computer knows that this is this or that object. If you walk into a design or an ideation session with these technical constraints in mind, you're really limiting the ideation. You're basically biased, and you really do want to avoid that. I really like working with a diverse set of teams in these ideation settings, where some of the students often that I work with or other kinds of practitioners or other faculty professors, where they have actually limited experience with XR, where they're thinking of it as being something that is magical and super powerful, because it doesn't hold them back in their ideation. And I think that is really, really important when it comes to design thinking for XR. Now, as we're entering the prototyping stage, when I work with students, and we have like these design concept ideas, we have ideated, and we have already some kind of like storyboards and wireframes, and now maybe we're moving already from paper to digital. Then one of the things that there's a tendency to do the basic things, like the things that you know already, to do them digitally. Like for example, a login screen. I always tease my students, don't do the login screen. First of all login screens look more or less the same. So what's the point of prototyping those digitally? You won't learn a lot more. What you should do instead is really focus on the unknown unknowns, okay? So there might be actually a lot of gaps in your current design idea and your design concept, and you use prototyping to really figure out how to fill those gaps. And that's the best way to approach it. So the prototyping doesn't need to happen in a complete prototype way. It can be more like a horizontal prototype, where it's more like the facade. So you're trying to figure out the whole front end and all the options kind of shown to the user. And if you're taking this approach, then you're less focused on the vertical, on the technology, and more focused on figuring out the entire user-facing parts of the interface, and ultimately fill all the gaps. But really, even then, don't start with the known interface parts and then just do them digitally. I mean, maybe you can do this for warm-up, but what you should really focus on is the things that you don't know yet how they would materialize in the user interface, for example. So focus on those things as you're prototyping your XR experience. So then when it comes to testing, testing is very, very interesting, because as we are using XR, we could actually use XR technologies to fill the gaps. So think of an interface that is nearly complete, but then you want something magical to appear, and you don't know yet how to prototype it. Now you could do this in a video prototype through some kind of overlays, using some video editing software. But you may also use some more advanced AR or VR tools to really bring in some of these overlays. So I want you to think of XR technologies to also fill the gaps in your XR prototypes. And so this is a very innovative use of using XR technologies to support prototyping and testing. To really, the idea in this testing phase is to simulate an almost complete user experience, to simulate the experience of a working prototype where everything has been implemented. And you can fill these gaps. If you don't have a full prototype implemented, you can fill these gaps using humans as wizards. So this idea of the Wizard of Oz to really fill the gaps. So Wizard of Oz prototyping and testing is a really key idea here that I think also makes a lot of sense in XR. And especially in XR, so for example, one of the things I have done is like jumping into a VR experience, and I was like more or less invisible to the VR user, and I could move things in VR to produce like a virtual, like a heads-up display to them. And they thought that, oh, these screens are animated and they're like moving and this interface is responsive, this personal assistant really understands me. But in fact, I was actually there in the background as a wizard or the computer to really fill in the gaps. And so I think that is a very cool way of simulating a more complete prototype that we then can test that way. So it could be a really intelligent system that we're prototyping that understands all kinds of gestures and speech commands, and in this kind of testing phase to really simulate the almost final user experience, even though we haven't fully implemented the system yet. Finally, when it comes to implementation, I think one of the common mistakes here is that many of us are very familiar with one tool, so for example Unity or Unreal. Some of us may know both, but then we don't actually consider other options, and we try to do everything with these tools because we think Unity or Unreal is the best tool. Now the point I want to make here is that you should use the best suited tool. So for example, an early stage prototype, you really don't have to run and go into Unreal and use all their high-end rendering capabilities. Or Unity, you also don't need to jump into Unity to get started. No, you can choose other kinds of prototyping tools, maybe more like geared towards immersive prototyping. So really have a variety of options and don't be afraid, even though it's not always easy to transition between some of these tools. Having this flexibility in terms of tools and knowing a variety of tools is really actually a strength, and that would enrich also the way you think about the problem, not just like with this one tool, but from multiple different perspectives. So next I'm going to quickly give a high-level overview of the common methods and tools that we would be using. So the first thing we really want to, the first deliverable in some sense we really want to accomplish is the problem statement. And the way we do a problem statement, or we go about a problem statement, is through scenarios and use cases and maybe diary studies. So you're asking users to take notes about their daily lives and reporting back to you what kinds of issues they had, for example, with as they were using your AR or VR prototype. You may be wanting to do some surveys, so a little bit more larger scale online or in specific user communities. You may want to do face-to-face interviews or actually put multiple people together in a focus group and putting these different stakeholders together to really frame the problem. So that's the problem statement. And then we really want to understand the user. We want to define who the user really is. A common technique here is to use personas. Now, personas, don't think of personas as these sheets that we fill in where every persona has like a cute name and maybe some characteristics. Think of personas more like as the meta behind creating these personas. That is actually where the rich information is. So not the sheet that I present to you, but actually the way I've constructed these personas. And if you've done this in the right way, it will be based on facts and data. And I'll talk a little bit more about personas later as well. Another way to define users and really understand who we're designing for and who we're not designing for is task analysis. And if you have already an existing prototype, you could use that to collect the data to some kind of logging and then log analysis. You may want to do user journeys, similar to the diary studies, but in this case maybe a little bit more visual, where people really think through their daily activities, and you're trying to find out what are the activities and what are the kinds of events and how do they in their day-to-day activities and how do they impact those activities. So user journey maps is something that is very popular in the user experience design community, and that's something that you could also apply to XR. Similarly, stakeholder maps, and there are all kinds of ways of really framing and understanding our users. Next, we really want to understand the competitive landscape. So what are the solutions out there? What are the factors where they are good? What are the good features? What kinds of features are missing? And a common way to get at this competitive analysis is a SWOT analysis. So you're looking at the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats, and doing this kind of analysis, which is more like coming from a business perspective, but it's often now applied to user experience design and interaction design as well. You could obviously look at existing products and download them and try them out. If you don't have access to some of the tools out there, you may want to base your knowledge on existing reviews out there. So there might have already be an existing user community, and there might be forums associated with the software solution where people complain a lot about something, and so that's a way to look at it. You could look at Stack Overflow or some of these common sources where people report issues and try to help each other. You could also do a more systematic research-based approach, kind of a literature review, and then really look at the things that are described maybe in white papers, in blog posts, or academic papers as well. And that way build your knowledge of, you really want to get the sense of the technology or the solution landscape out there, and really who are the competitors. As you're going about your design and you're drawing from the knowledge that you have generated from the problem statement and really framing the user, and then also understanding the competitors, you're going to do something about design synthesis. So really like getting all the data and facts together and performing what I refer to as design space analysis. And here I'll introduce you to a technique called QOC analysis, so questions, options, and criteria. So questions, options, and criteria. You're asking questions about the options that you have available, and then you're determining criteria that will help you actually choose the best option if you want. I think this is a very cool way of analyzing a design space, and it's very useful. If you're more into software engineering or systems, you usually think in terms of functional and non-functional requirements lists. So functional really like about the system and things you can like measure, like system performance, response time, and those kinds of things. And then non-functional requirements as well, so more associated with user characteristics or the soft things that are hard to implement. So to give you an example of scenarios, here are two scenarios that we've used in our work on cross-device augmented reality, and we were basically using these, at the time, more futuristic scenarios. What if a family wanted to place furniture in the living room? What if they could do this collaboratively using different kinds of augmented reality devices? Or what if a bunch of friends wanted to collaboratively play some kind of laser shooting game where they're shooting, inspired from Robo-Raid on the HoloLens, where they're shooting these kinds of bugs from the future. How could we enable that collaboratively? And so we basically did a scenario-based analysis. So we threw these scenarios visually as images at our participants, and then we really asked them to try to solve these scenarios and think through some of the issues, whether they are designers or developers or end users. So we really studied with all these three types of populations and really wanted to understand how they think about these scenarios. And that helped us really drive a lot of the requirements and then build a solution for cross-device augmented reality. It's a paper that I'll share with you if you feel like you'd like to take a look. So when we talk about scenarios, we really need to take into account 5 key elements. So really the setting, so the situation or the state of the system, the context of use, basically the physical environment in which the activity occurs. So then you need to look at the agents or the users. So what are they trying to accomplish as they're performing these activities? You need to think about the goals that they have. So what are their objectives and what are they trying to accomplish? And then what actions do they take to really accomplish their goals? And if there are any kinds of outside events, maybe triggered by the system or somehow by the setting on the environment, really things that happen to the users while doing their activities. And if you bring in these 5 different scenario elements, you'll actually really explore a future scenario of use of your interface in a very comprehensive way. Most scenarios that I read when presented to me are focused on just the user, which is similar to just a persona, or just the setting, but I don't learn enough about the goals and the actions. And if I learn more about the actions, I can also envision already a potential solution and the system behind the scenes. So it's really important to address all these 5 elements as you're doing some kind of scenario-based analysis. Next, I want to talk about personas. Personas are really commonly used to communicate users of our system. And personas in a more traditional sense, as I said, in a user experience design and research sense, personas would really be used to distill all the facts and all the knowledge we have about our users. That we have gathered through interviews, observations, any kinds of surveys and other kinds of instruments that you may have implemented to really figure out the issues. But at the core, persona is really used to describe to other designers who we are designing for and who we're not designing for. So common elements of a persona are some kind of descriptive persona name, a photo maybe that shows the user or the context attributes. So it's very important to learn more about the scenario. And then often what helps in a persona is a quote that best represents this persona. And then usually you list the goals, you list their frustrations and needs, if they told you explicitly or based on your interpretation of what they told you. And then also their motivations, so incentive, fear, achievement, growth, power. These are kinds of common attributes, kind of that you find in a persona template. And so we need to distinguish different types of personas here. So commonly we talk about primary and secondary personas. So primary personas really refer to users where we believe that our design completely satisfies their goals and needs, as opposed to secondary users where we think that our design mostly, but not completely, meets their goals and needs. And then we also have this idea of negative personas. And this really helps to communicate to our stakeholders who we are not or not yet designing for. So our design at this stage doesn't actually target any of their goals or needs. So personas is a really common technique in user experience research and design. And what is unique or more special to XR? So I think when we construct personas, more specifically for an XR experience, we really need to think about how much experience do these personas actually have. Are they a novice or an expert, XR designer, developer, or user? And then what are good metrics to express their experience? So there could be kind of like self-rated scales, or they tell you how many months of experience they have, or how many times per week or even per day they use an XR experience. And then they should also give you examples of devices and applications that they have used. So I think if you ask for all these kinds of things as background information, and if you specify that for your personas, then this is a very good way to frame and identify who are your primary and your secondary users. So in a lot of my research, I often targeted novice designers to enable them to be able to create XR experiences without being a developer or a programmer. And so that's how I would normally fill in the personas. Now, I do think that developers could be the secondary personas in a lot of my research, because a lot of my work is focused on rapid prototyping. And while my techniques are targeted at more like novice designers or novice XR creators, even experienced XR creators could benefit from some of the techniques. So I would consider them as secondary users. And in a lot of my research, I focus more on designers and developers rather than users or end users. And so an end user, so somebody who uses that design created by the designer that is using my tool, so that end user would be an example of a negative persona in a lot of my work. Doesn't mean that I don't like XR users, it just means that I currently don't really design for them, that my solution is really geared towards XR creators. So talking more about personas and constructing personas, I have a list of do's and don'ts here. So what you should really do is clarify how these personas were created. Are they constructed or are they facts-based? Ideally, you should actually base them on data and facts, but often personas are just used as a tool to communicate to other stakeholders who we are designing for, as I said, and so you should just be very clear and honest about that. And what is very important is that you actually let those personas reflect your diverse target user groups. So don't, if you think in terms of 3 personas, don't make them all the same. In the activities that I usually do with my students when we are constructing personas, I really want them to think about the most unique and very different types of users that they might be designing for, to really explore that space a little bit better. And in addition to primary and secondary personas, we really also should always include negative personas to make it clear to others who we are not designing for. So what you shouldn't do is just make assumptions. You shouldn't stereotype personas. So don't bring in this persona of this old person that can't use computers, for example, or even bring in certain genders and discriminate against them, or race. And even though I teach in a very diverse and inclusive environment, I still see this happen all the time among my students, and I want you to be careful. Finally, don't confuse negative personas with people you don't want to use your solution. No, negative personas are really the people that you're currently not targeting in your design. Doesn't prevent them from using your solution, but maybe in a future iteration of your design, you may target them more specifically and then cater more to their needs and support more of their goals. So what I often use is a kind of template where I list out the competitors on one side and then all the kinds of features or even non-features, bugs on this side, and I call them factors. So you do this as the columns and the competitors as the rows, and the competitors really are the solutions, let's say the XR applications that are out there. And rather than just like putting indicators which of these factors are supported, I usually write how well they are supported and how they are in fact implemented. And this actually differs between solutions. But for the purposes of this presentation, let's just put X's as checks and supports this factor or not. And like with personas, I think of competitors as direct competitors, partial competitors, indirect, parallel, and analogous. So this seems very fine-grained here, but there are actually significant differences between each of these. So direct and partial makes sense. Direct in some sense is really overlapping. This competitor really provides the same features and services and targets the same users. Partial is there is a subset of the features, for example, supported, or they only target a subset of the users that you have identified through your personas. Now, an indirect competitor is somebody who goes about the same problem and so in that sense is similar, but goes about it in a different way. And because they're still targeting the same problem, and even though they go about it in a slightly different way, they are still a competitor. Now a parallel competitor is similar to what you have in mind, but they're not necessarily a direct competitor. And finally, an analogous competitor is actually a non-competitor. This is basically somebody who is basically a solution that is targeting different users and different goals and needs, but there is something in their design that inspires you. And so what I usually do with my students is I really encourage them to think about the direct and the partial competitors, and maybe some indirect and parallel competitors as well, but really find those analogous competitors. Existing interfaces that may address a different problem, but there's something very interesting and inspiring about their design, and that is something that maybe you want to think about adapting and incorporating into your solution, and that is fine, usually. All right, and so then the way you go about these competitors and the competitive analysis, as I said, is through SWOT analysis, where you identify the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. And now here is a common pitfall that I see among a lot of my students. We're doing this competitive analysis, and we're drawing out this whole landscape, and then our solution is trying to do it all and just do everything better. We really like all these factors are important, and so we're trying to build this super solution. And that is really not how you should think about it. What you should do instead is maybe find the gaps. There must be gaps between some of the factors. They don't really cater to the user's needs. They don't really address their goals. And that's where you need to innovate. So don't try to do a dashboard that integrates everything, but instead try to find a more focused solution that really establishes new factors and that's the niche, and that's what you're gearing your XR solution towards. That's that. We now have looked at the scenarios. I've shown you examples of personas. We've done a competitive analysis, and I will have a separate video and separate modules dedicated towards storyboarding, so that's not covered here. But these four types of input really form what we then call the concept model or your design concept. And that is really how you think about the solution as the designer. Now keep in mind that that mental model of that system that you are creating, the key challenge is to really invoke that mental model also in your users. And in fact, most systems fail because users often have a very different mental model, quite different from the concept model that the designer had in mind. So the designer's mental model of the system. But if they match, then you're really doing a very good job. Think about how you think about how an ATM works. Yeah? You're putting in your card, you're asking for money, it's going to give you back your card, and then you're going to get the money. A designer of that ATM might think about it very differently, much more fine-grained, very specific, all kinds of error scenarios. And let's say if that ATM never ate your card, you didn't even know that this was possible. Your mental model is that ATMs are really nice, they always give you money, you've never experienced not having money on the account, or maybe you have. And so think about these different user experiences. So eating your card, or insufficient funds, or maybe some error, there's actually enough money but something went wrong with the bank. And think about all these user experiences, and their mental models of ATMs might be very different from someone who always had enough money, whose card was never eaten, and they never actually had an issue with an ATM. And also think about this the next time you're going to use the next ATM. Once one of these disruptive user experiences has happened to you, you will be very afraid. I have more examples like this. For example, checkout lines, self-checkout lines specifically. I always get very nervous about the machines in those instructions. And so these are really examples where the design concept, if you think about it in principle, might make sense from the designer's perspective. But all these disruptive user experiences lead to very different mental models of these systems, and so there's this interesting clash. And so there is a good way to go about this design synthesis and actually building this concept model. This concept model, or your design concept, is really, in some sense, the specification that you want to give to a developer. So this is how I think about the system. This is what we need to implement for our XR solution. So design space analysis, I really like this idea of asking questions, considering the options that we have for any kinds of questions like how to display something. We can display it permanently or appearing. And then really putting out the criteria. When would we use which option, and what does which option actually mean? So weighing these options and then finally actually making a design choice for one of the options. So for example here, appearing. And so there's work on that, and I'll provide the reference about this design space analysis. And this really often happens implicitly among designers. We ask questions all the time, we consider options all the time. So the hard part when it comes to XR is really asking the right questions. How to display things, how to track things, how to travel in VR or in AR, how to manipulate things, and how to collaborate. These are like some of the big questions that I usually come up with or go through when I create a new XR experience. And let's just look at one example here. So how to display, obviously we just had permanent or appearing, but when we think about appearing, it's not just whether something appears on screen or not. In XR, we can also place things in the world, and so in AR that might be somewhere tied to a physical location, or in VR somewhere tied to a virtual location, and may not always be visible to the user, and may only be appearing when the virtual camera moves it into view. We may also have this kind of like compromise solution where once we see it, it follows you around. So as you move the camera, it kind of like travels with you. And so these are some of the options that you are considering, even just for this appearing example and how to display things in XR. Now, design thinking, as I said, is really about a mindset, building empathy with your users and then trying to define the problem and really innovating in a meaningful way. And that to me is very, very important. In the XR space, the meaningful part often comes too short. I was thinking, what are 4 principles that I could convey to you? And so maybe you take them with you and you incorporate them into your design thinking. And so these 4 principles, and they have been, I've been shaped in many different ways. Where I've been, studying computer science at ETH Zurich, for example. I went to the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon and was teaching there a little bit. And now I've been a professor for several years at the University of Michigan, teaching user experience design and research, and now obviously also AR/VR courses. And so from these various experiences, I have actually incorporated these 4 principles into my design thinking, and maybe this helps you as well. So here's the first principle. The user is not you. If you're a designer, you really have to think about that design from not like what is easy for you and what are the kinds of things you can detect and recognize and what gestures work well from a computational perspective. No, you have to think about it from the user perspective, and this is the primary challenge. So my second principle as a designer is it's really hard to unlearn. And I often have to remind myself, because I tend to forget how hard it is to do, for example, basic web stuff. I mean, I say now basic web stuff because it is hard for me to imagine this initial stuff. Or the first time you open up Unity or Unreal and how intimidating some of this software can be. And now that I've used these tools for many years, I've learned so much, and it's really hard to unlearn. And so the way I want to illustrate that point is some of you may have seen this optical illusion before, and maybe you're able to see 2 people in this optical illusion. Most of you will see 1. If you haven't seen this before, you will either see a young lady or an old lady. And that really depends on how much time you give yourself and which elements you focus on in this optical illusion. But let me sketch out the young woman. Basically, this is her chin, her eye, this is her hair, and she's looking over her right shoulder. And now the old woman is, this becomes the nose. You see one eye here and one eye there, and this is then the older lady's chin, and this is her mouth. And so this is the old and the young lady's hair. And so now I've shown both these women to you, and the next time you will see this, I promise you, you will at least remember, oh, there are 2 people in there, and then a second later you will be able to see both again. And it's really hard for you to unlearn. And so it's the same as a designer. So if a user expresses issues to you that seem trivial or like, why didn't they know that? Keep that in mind. Just because you know that and you have learned that. So the problem with that is that it actually makes it very hard for you to put yourselves into the shoes of a novice user. And that's just something to keep in mind. My third principle is about this difference between how junior and senior designers approach this design. And this is an example that I've borrowed. And a junior designer really usually thinks there is one path, and then they will stick to that path and eventually get to that solution. Now, there is no direct line from the problem to the solution. This dotted line here doesn't actually exist. But we may just like follow this lead, and then we're doing a little bit of iteration, and then really stuck on that idea, and that is really like how you end up with this kind of path. But a more experienced designer would really explore alternate paths, so different designs, and then take some of these more promising designs further, and then explore some of these branches, and maybe even go a step back and figure out an alternative to the alternative, and then finally get to a really good solution. And this is how you should go about design. Be a more senior designer, if you will. My fourth principle, and this is something that I just say from a lot of experience, and when I work with students especially, They always think about prototype is just a prototype, and then what's the product? And so I just say to you, everything is a prototype. Even the latest XR device that you may hold in your hand right now, that is a product, it's advertised as a product, it is still a prototype. We're still very far away from this final vision of XR devices and XR experiences incorporated maybe into our daily lives, enriching our activities. And so just keep that in mind, and don't really try to draw the line between prototype and product. Just be honest. So that's my fourth principle, that everything is a prototype and there is no final product. I use the term final prototype more like as this is the last thing that we'll prototype. It doesn't mean that it's the finished product. And so maybe that's a good way to think about prototyping and product. And also, there's really no difference in terms of the methods and tools that they're using to create prototypes and that they're using to create a product. I think it becomes a product the more you invest in service and advertising. And these are things that you usually don't do with prototypes. And prototypes really you should be okay to let them go, to throw them away. A throwaway prototype is still a good prototype. But a throwaway product, a failed product, is really not what you want. So embrace these different methods and tools that I summarized here in this XR design thinking lecture, and hopefully find good, meaningful designs that eventually would be regarded a useful and applicable product. In this video, we're going to talk about XR design ethics. Now, design ethics is really, really important. We need to really think about that in the space of XR. Ethical and responsible design, you have actually a great responsibility. As you're designing a virtual reality around your users, you have to make sure that they are safe, that they are protected. And that's hard, especially given that you don't know much about the environment in which the users are using your applications. And when it comes to AR as well, you have to really make a lot of trade-offs in terms of how much do you need to know about the environment, the people around the users, about the users themselves, the devices that they're using, the context where they're using this. And so when you have all that information, do you really make use of it? Does it really significantly improve the design of your application? Now, in many cases, you won't have access to all that data just because the technology isn't there yet. And we always feel like, oh yeah, we need all that information. But we should really think about how much information we need in order to provide a compelling design. And our rationale or our goal should be to work with the minimum data rather than trying to, get it all and then see what we can do with it. You really have to figure out how to minimize the risk and how to maximize the safety of your users. And as I was designing this lecture, I was thinking about these following questions. What when users can't tell what's real and what's virtual anymore? What is the role and responsibility of the XR designer? How do we hold XR designers accountable? What happens when users go against your intended design? All these things combined, I was thinking, what are good ethics principles of XR design? This is a space that I'm just thinking about a lot, and there are not so many really good guidelines. So there's not like a list of 10 things to follow and it'll be perfect. No, there's an intuition that you have to develop as a designer. You really have to know the technologies, you really have to understand the design space, and then you have to make really, really good choices in the interest of the users. So I wanted to start with design ethics principles. And quite fundamentally, there are like 3. Autonomy. So the user is in control at all times. Transparency. The user is informed about how to control or be in control and stay in control. And safety. The user is protected from danger, risk, and injury. So autonomy, transparency, and safety. These are like the really high principles. And if you look at existing design guidelines, like from all the main vendors, safety, and that is both the physical but also the psychological safety, those are really values that are held up very highly. It's really emphasized, but it's hard to find concrete guidelines that help you make good decisions. And unfortunately, it is often through misuse of a design that we learn about the negative consequences of our design. And by misuse, I just mean that something maybe you haven't considered in your design process. So we have to think about how we approach design more holistically. So one way to think about design, or responsible design in this case, is to not just focus on how to best use your solution, so improve and optimize the design of your solution so that it's really good for users, and following design patterns, established design patterns, or helping by creating new designs and shaping new design patterns. No, we should also consider how your solution could be misused, so the dark patterns of design. So now the problem with both design patterns and dark patterns is that they're both still really emerging. Now there's not like a list of these patterns and then these dark patterns and be careful. It's not like that. I mean, here's a way to think about it. You need to think holistically. So you need to think about the context, the situations and the conditions in which the users are and in which your experience, that the one that you are designing, will be run by the users. You need to think about the tasks that you want your users to be able to do. What kinds of actions or interactions can they do? What are the kinds of the events that might be generated by the system? And how might users respond to those kinds of events? Then obviously you need to really think about the device cameras, the sensors and the algorithms. Now as a designer, you're designing for a kind of like a device, and you could say that you are actually a user of that device, since you're not necessarily improving the algorithms on these devices and platforms. But you can still be careful and you can still make good decisions in terms of the devices that you build on. So we also need to think about data collection, processing, and management pipelines. Especially as a researcher, you really aim to get as much data as possible. Also, obviously, as a designer working for a business, because information is key. But here, I would really encourage you to think about, do we really need all that data? So frameworks, libraries, and tools that you are using for application development, that is really something that you are making active choices. And so you should again know what's going on behind the scenes and make informed decisions. And then obviously the user interface and interaction design. This whole course is really focused on user interface and interaction design, but this is not the only place where we really need to pay attention and make sure that we are, for example, not endangering our users, not promoting weird interactions. And then not only at the user interface, but obviously also at the data level, we really need to think about data ownership, the governance, so really what happens with this data once collected, where it's stored, how it's being processed, and then also, and this is really important, future use of that data. I mean, just because a user might agree to give you the information so that they can run that XR session and place a couple of objects in their living room or kitchen or bedroom, doesn't mean that you should be using that data in the future. You as the designer, vendor, these are things to think about. And there may be many more, but this is actually what I come up with as I think about both the design and the development of a new XR application and a user experience that I think is safe and potentially helpful and useful to users. So what I'd like to do now is actually bring in a different perspective. As a researcher, I often have like new ideas, and some of them might be crazy and a little bit borderline, right? Some of them may involve deception, and that's something that's okay in research as long as you debrief and also get informed consent from users. Now that is something that I'd like to emphasize a little bit. What I really find interesting that in research, in scientific research, at least in North America, which is what I'm most familiar with at the moment, we do have established ethical review processes. But it's really important that you navigate all these things so that actually users' rights, so study participants' rights are protected. Well, one way to think about the ethical review process is that it's really a risk assessment. Are the users or the participants in this case, are they exposed to risk that is more than what they are usually encountering in daily life? And so it is a very interesting lens that may help us, or maybe you as a designer, also to better understand what could be ethical design. So I'm going to walk you through ethical review, and I'm going to try to apply that process, as far as I understand it, to XR. So when you want to do a new user study, you really have to define the purpose, the procedure, and the duration. So that's really key information. So what is the purpose of any data that we acquire? That's what I would like to ask you here. And then also, what is the procedure for you to collect that data? Really think this through. And then also, how long do we need to collect that data? So is it just one session? Is it every session? And how long do we keep it? And do we intend future use? And do we tell our users? And not in the small print of some kind of really long document about the policy and the terms of use and all that. No, we probably need to think about better ways of integrating and incorporating those kinds of things in the user interface. Well, if you're a little bit more advanced as a designer, you know the consequences of each of these things. But as a user, you may not. And so is the user really making an informed decision? Well, all they want is run your app in most cases. So, but that's not good enough. From an ethical perspective, that's not good enough. It has to be informed consent. So the other main goal with an ethical review is to really understand whether there are direct benefits to users. And so what you want to do is actually maximize the benefits and limit the trade-offs. So what are the expected benefits to users, and are they direct? So can they perceive them? So and I'm going to inject acceptable trade-offs in realism, comfort, and safety. And are these reasonable? The third aspect of an ethical review is really a demonstrated effort that you're trying to minimize the risks of your participants. So what are the content-induced risks to users? And associated with that is the question of how to limit the data and any entities that collect, process, and manage it. And by entities, I really mean like the algorithms, all the steps in the pipeline, all the kinds of different solutions and service providers that are involved in making you track the gestures and understand the speech commands and all of that. Really, you want to keep that very, very small. As a researcher, I usually say, okay, the only person or people that have access to the research data is me as the investigator, and then my research team. And finally, I think, and this is maybe a little bit unique here, or a little bit of a different view on ethical review, this idea of agency and autonomy to really empower participants. So how do you enable your users to stay in control? Well, as a designer, for example, you may really strive for this high level of immersion, just because you think virtual reality has to be like really realistic. But like, imagine ways for users to control the level of detail, just like you have in any computer game. You can usually control the graphics. So now this was my version of an ethical review of XR. And now I want to switch gears and actually talk about this idea of doing a design ethics review and provide a couple of ideas of how to approach it and think about it. So the first really big thing to think about, and there are 4 in total, in my opinion at least, is context and situation. Where is the XR device being used? Who is around the user? The second important thing is the sensory information and the data that we are collecting. So what does the XR device see? What kind of data is acquired? So these are really important questions that you should be answering for your design. and it may really vary depending on context and situation. So there's an interesting dependency between the first and the second kind of quadrant here. So then we need to think about the processing pipeline. And this is something, as a designer, you may struggle a little bit, maybe because you're using all kinds of solutions that are kind of like a black box to you. But that's where I would encourage you to really learn more about the technology. So what happens on device is a really, really important question to be answered. So what kind of data is collected and then processed on device? And how is that data processed otherwise? If not on device, well, it has to be somewhere online in the cloud. And that means it's going to be transferred to a third party. I mean, from the user's perspective, it's a third party because that's maybe something they didn't know. That party is involved. And so that's a little bit of a risk, isn't it? So what happens in the cloud? Who manages the cloud? What kind of protection is provided? What is the service level agreement? So these are all kinds of things you need to think about. So the fourth big topic of our design ethics review has to be about data ownership and governance. So who owns and manages the data, and how is the user informed about this? And is it explicit or implicit, or do we never tell them? Or have you not thought about it? Okay, so I'll stop teasing you there, but really this is something that we should think about. And really, really important is that this design ethics review happens continuously throughout design, not just at the end when all the decisions have been made. So this is a mindset that you have to apply as you're making design decisions and forming a rationale about those design decisions. My first example is home decoration. This is inspired from the IKEA Place app. And so now we have a family here, they're all using their devices and they're deciding together what kind of furniture to get and where to place it. And the example here is a living room, but it could be all kinds of other rooms. So let's analyze this a little bit, do a little bit of a design ethics review given what we just learned. So the context and situation here, okay, I said it's living room and it's family. So let's just say it's the family and every member of that family agreed that they will all want to come together and use the devices in this interesting way. And then the sensory information and data, well, user bystanders, and these bystanders are family members. We do see furniture. We may be able to infer something from that furniture. Is it expensive furniture? How much furniture? How old furniture? So that is something that is potentially sensitive information. And then the geometry. Yes, so the app needs to understand the geometry of the environment, and then it can do a basic object detection, mostly in terms of the furniture that it knows. So in this case, probably IKEA furniture that it has like access to as a catalog. So, but lots of things could go wrong here in terms of like other kinds of objects being introduced and then misclassification, etc. So then we're looking at the processing pipeline. So in this example, actually the original was marker-based, but now we have marker-less implementations. So basically the devices do their own scanning of the environment, relatively limited at the moment in terms of scene understanding. Finally, data ownership and governance. So here, obviously, the data ownership might be with the app developer. I don't actually know who developed IKEA Place. Maybe it was IKEA. And then when it comes to the question of how is the user informed, obviously that is through some kind of language, terms of use when you like find that application and download it. And then a little bit through visualization because, for example, it'll render a little bit of a pattern across the surfaces that it detects. And it gives you a sense of what the device sees. But don't be fooled. That is just a visualization of the kinds of information that the device is relatively positive about, relatively sure that this is a surface. It still sees many other things that it may not visualize to the user. So keep that in mind, and that's our little this is our first little design ethics review for this scenario. So now I'm going to port us into a different scenario. We're still kind of like in the same realm, people together in a living room, for example, and now they're playing a collaborative game. So one of the big differences in this scenario is that you're not paying as much attention to what kind of things you're looking at. When you're designing and decorating your home, you're really in control of that device. But when you're playing a game and that game makes objects appear there and even places that maybe you didn't want the camera to see, but just to participate in that game, you do this, and obviously your movement is a lot faster, so it makes it a lot harder for devices to really sense things and understand it, but we're getting there. So the other thing I wanted to express in this scenario is now we're actually using very different display technologies. You see a HoloLens user here on the left, some kind of HoloLens is actually HoloLens 1 here. We're using some kind of projection and camera-based system, so a Kinect here, so this is a ProCam setup, and so that a user even without device can participate and see this kinds of experience. And then we see a smartphone user here on the right. So all kinds of very different display technologies, and each of these have very different tracking technologies involved. Now that is interesting. Now I want to bring in another consideration, which is like if these were in different environments, and now each user in their own home are participating in this collaborative game, what does that mean for the data? And now there is no way to handle it locally. Well, this kind of information gathering and processing and coordination among these devices, so to get them into the same coordinate frames and making sure that these devices can collaborate, that already requires some kind of server-side infrastructure, but that server could still be part of the home network. Now in this remote setup, that's different. Now we have to go online, and now we have to process, and now we have to transfer that data between participants, between users, and now that introduces interesting new issues. So for this scenario, I'm not going to do a design ethics review. I just wanted to point out a few differences, and I'm going to do the same for two more variations of a second scenario. So the second scenario, imagine a classroom lecture. So this is now more like a public context. So you're like going to a lecture hall, maybe you're a student or you're going to a conference and there's a speaker up front. And so that speaker wants you to participate in this really cool AR experience where you can see the solar system. And you're using all kinds of devices here, the different users, and they're kind of engaged, so pretty cool. So public space, all kinds of different devices, both handheld and head-worn, could also be kind of marker-based. And now a different variation of this scenario, it's now a team meeting. So you're going with team members into a smaller room. It could be some office space or some public building or even your home. So how would that change how you would use this AR application? So things to consider here are this could be a more private or still a public environment. You may or may not know those users and you don't know what kinds of applications they have installed on these devices. And also you need to think about these different devices coming together here and all that to support a human anatomy application so that we can learn about human anatomy. So all kinds of interesting things to consider here. So the last thing I wanted to throw in is the consideration of design impact. And that's something you have to consider at different stages. So you have to think about it before, during, and after the users are experiencing your experience, so your application. So before, and this could already be in the App Store, if that's the distribution channel, you should really set the expectations of the users for that new reality. So whatever it is that you're porting them into some fancy or scary virtual world, or how you may change, manipulate, modify, diminish, whatever you do to their real world in an augmented reality version of your application. And so you need to prepare them so that they know. And then obviously during the experience, you really need to balance the realism, comfort, and safety. And the trade-off should really be around the realism, and what you want to maximize is safety, comfort, and then maybe realism. You didn't even see that, so maybe realism is there. Finally, you need to think about what happens after they have tried out your experience. So the impact of your experience afterwards, it may actually shape the next kinds of interactions that they encounter in daily life or with another kind of XR experience. And yes, okay, maybe you feel like your responsibility ends there, but you really need to think about that as well. So help users transition back to the old reality. And this could be through some kind of debriefing or even during the experience, asking them to take breaks, to remind them of the real world, because being addicted, while it might be good for revenue, is not really good from a design perspective, especially from an ethical design perspective. Okay, and now I wanted to give 3 examples from my own research. And 2 of these examples are actually about projects that I've worked on, where we had to make very interesting design ethics decision. And the 3rd example is one where I decided not to pursue it. Just because from an ethical perspective, I really didn't feel this was a good thing to do. The first example is from a mixed reality crisis simulation and triage training app. And I'm not going to show any pictures here, but we really had to design how realistic should we make the injuries. Now, that was an interesting project. We were working with a professional in nursing, also a professor here at the University of Michigan, really understood all that. And she actually helped us create the virtual injuries by using a mannequin and some kind of like blood and then taking realistically looking photographs and sending me all these pictures. Basically, the task that I set the students was like place these injuries so that they appear realistic and anatomically correct. And so I'm not going to actually show any of these materials here, as I said, but I really thought we need trigger warnings even as I was working with my students, and we really had to make the trade-off between making it super realistic and making it just help inform the triage decision making, which follows a specific protocol. So we were designing 2 levels of injuries, and we allowed users to pick it. And one important consideration here, though, is that if you're a medicine student, the further you are along in your studies, the more things you have seen. And now, with our design, what we could enable is early students in their career, as well as more advanced students who have obviously a higher threshold now, work together. And that app was still supposed to invoke some stress to make it a realistic scenario, because in a disaster, you really need to be calm, and that is something you need to train. And if we just show kind of like comic style injuries, you're not going to feel stressed. And so that was a very interesting scenario to navigate. And the second example is from a master thesis recently completed in my lab. And that was with a really cool student who came from Colombia and also wanted to do a little bit of a field study there in a museum of memory. And the idea of this project was to build empathy, but avoid re-victimization, as we're using augmented reality to bring some of these stories and the narrative of those stories closer to the users. Now, without going into too much detail, that is a really difficult to do. That is a really difficult thing to do. And in this project, we really worked together with the staff of that Museum of Memory who had significant experience. And the important thing is we didn't want to design this naive AR application where it's just like place images everywhere, make it immersive as much as possible. No, this is really something where you have to understand the technology very well. That's why I was so fascinated by the project, and we had to make very careful decisions. In the end, it was a very complex project, and we are still processing some of these research findings and thinking about how to communicate that research to the community. But I wanted to include it here because obviously it was a recent project and work that my student did, and I was very proud of her and that work, and so I wanted to mention it here. The third project is one that I did not pursue. Student walks into my office, really great student. We both learned from each other that we had lost loved ones, actually deceased family members, and what if we could bring them back? How could we even bring them back? What would it be like to bring back a deceased family member in VR? And that is a project that I was like, wow, okay. I mean, I can probably do this. I mean, I can think about the technology. And is it going to be 360, or is it going to be virtual reality, or is it going to be augmented reality? And what are the consequences of mixing that experience, of bringing back the deceased person and making them appear in real life, so in augmented reality? And yeah, so I didn't want to do this. And I think, and the student understood, and we made the decision together, and I think that is fine. Now, we have not done this, but as I said, somebody else has. And now I feel like somebody else has to live with that decision. And the other way to look at this is like, had we done it, maybe we could have explored that project in a really good way and make very good ethical decisions, and then inform or somehow influence that other project that happened without us. So that's maybe the one regret that I have here. So this last part of the lecture was a little, you know, thinking about things, and I hope that you understand the importance of the topic of ethics. I hope that you forgive that it's not like this checklist. It's not that easy. And so I want to go to my last slide, the things we should keep in mind as we think about design ethics and XR design ethics specifically. So in every decision you have to make, consider the cost-benefit ratio to the users, okay? And especially the cost. So with all design decisions you make, carefully weigh the trade-offs. Don't make critical decisions for users. Enable them to make those. So you should really think about, how do you actually provide for a customization support? How do you communicate customization options to users? And how do you enable and empower your users to make those decisions, rather than you making all the decisions around the immersion and the level of realism and how you blend objects into their environment and the kinds of information and hand gestures and speech and whether you identify all the people around them and what you do with that information. No, you think about how to communicate that to users, and that is actually a really, really difficult design problem. And now we're talking. All right, obviously then you need to stay aware, so always learn. And these ethics considerations must evolve as XR technologies evolve. So in a few months or years from now, we may know better. And maybe I'll have to really redo that lecture. But this is the best I could do at this stage. Now, think a little bit about my background. I'm a computer scientist. I am trained in human-computer interaction, but more on the ethical side. And if somebody else has a very different opinion about XR design ethics, and I would really like to talk to that person. I'm sure there are both good elements in what I talked about and elements that you could critique, and I'm open to critique. But I hope that I provide at least some kind of thought framework for you to navigate that space, which is a really difficult space. So build these ethics considerations directly into your workflow, adapt both. So really not an afterthought, okay? Directly part of your process. Embed it in every decision you make. And then finally, and this is more like speaking to you guys out there developing technology, and then you guys out there designing for this technology, you really have to know the tech. And don't overpromise with what you say your solution can do. Okay, I've been in so many discussions around the things that devices see and how tracking actually works. And while it's very scary, so for example, to use a VR device like that in the background with all the cameras that it has for inside-out tracking, while that may be very, very scary for passers-by, the average person that may not fully grasp the reality of these devices and understand what's going on technically, you have that responsibility to inform the users and the non-users around that device that something is going on. And this idea of like some kind of red blinking light so that you know that we are recording and the device is seeing something, that is the most naive way to approach this topic. So that is not the solution. And the other thing you really have to be clear about, and the other thing I wanted to touch on is like I've seen so many promotional videos that really annoy me just because they don't advertise the product correctly. The device can actually not see anything when you have your hands down here, and the field of view is like this rather than like that, and whatever they suggest and how they have composed that video. And there's also something wrong there from an ethics perspective. And so don't overpromise. And then as a researcher, this is really clear. I will never get my stuff published unless I really talk about the limitations. And in order to talk about the limitations, you have to explore the limitations. So every solution has limitations, and you really need to learn about them, and then you need to be upfront about them. You can't fix them all. Some of these limitations may have to do with the technology that you're choosing, or somewhere deep down in some kind of framework that you're relying on, or some platform. And so it's just important that you know and that you consider this. And so this is where I end with my lecture on XR and design ethics. So this is really a topic that is evolving. A lot of people have talked about it from the user perspective, realism and all the kinds of side effects, and is it good for some kind of therapy, and what are the long-term use effects, and what are the effects on children. And I wanted to do a lecture that helps us as designers think through this. Now, I probably didn't get this super right, but if I accomplished something, I made you think more about the design decisions that you're making, and also trying to hold them up to some kind of ethics standard, a code of conduct that we really still have to develop together in this field. And I hope that some of my efforts, and then obviously all the other amazing people out there that are working on accessibility and other kinds of issues around privacy and security, that we're all coming together in this, and we're finding really good ethical frameworks that help us think through those things and avoid making mistakes when it comes to design decisions. So XR design guidelines is a really, really important topic. And the problem that we have right now is that XR design is really a moving target. So many new kinds of devices coming out, and some of them are changing really the way we interact. Now that we have hand tracking available and eye tracking as input on both AR and VR devices, it is very interesting where this leads in terms of design evolution. And so I really struggled a little bit when I wanted to put this lecture together here. I was hoping that I can share something practical, and really wanted to have concrete guidelines as much as possible. And I've looked at all the guidelines that are out there, and we're going to review some of them here as well. But the issue is really that there is no perfect guidelines out there. So the moral of the story and the essence of the message here in the end is that you just have to try it out. And you have to think from the perspective of a user, not just design and implement the things that you think are easy as a designer. No, you really have to look at what is meaningful, what is useful, usable, and also consider long-term use, and hopefully develop an intuition over time that allows you to determine whether something is a good or a bad design. But yeah, that's just like my perspective. I've still tried to put together a few guidelines for us to get started, and we can use these guidelines to review each other's designs throughout the course. And but think of it really as a source, a starting point, a source of guidelines that can evolve hopefully over time, and that's really how design works. So we're still in this part of the course where we're more on the design thinking side. So what's the best way to learn about XR design? So I think it's actually studying design guidelines. So what is the knowledge that is out there, and which of these guidelines are really like something we have to adhere to, and which of these we can bend to potentially innovate in design. We need to learn how to critique existing designs, and actually that critique will really involve a lot of constructive criticism and suggestions for improvement. A lot of this should be based on guidelines as much as possible. It should be objective. And finally, we want to be able to create our own design. So I'd say in all of these efforts, it's really important to learn about guidelines. So when we have a look around, there are actually quite a few guidelines out there. And I think we can distinguish them into like 4 types of guidelines or sources. Those by vendors that I think are mostly platform driven. Those by designers. The good thing about those is that they're really user-oriented and they're coming more from a human-computer interaction perspective. Then there are those created by practitioners, so really experience-based, not necessarily with scientific rigor, and that's where I would draw the line to those established by researchers. Usually empirically derived, some kind of lab-based user studies and controlled experiments. And so there are all those guidelines out there, and I'll provide references to some of the promising examples. In this video, I'm gonna review a few of the vendor-based guidelines, and then I'm gonna share some of my own experience and insights. And we're gonna actually go on a little trip as part of a recent experience where I went to a remote conference, IEEE virtual reality conference, and so I thought it's actually quite cool to look at how researchers and designers implement current virtual worlds, for example, to support something like a remote conference attendance. And so we're going to look at that, and that's one of the examples I have here as well. So let's look at a few guidelines first. I picked Oculus guidelines. They're mostly focused on VR. Then I picked some from Google. They're focused on AR core and so handheld AR. And then I was also looking at other sources, Apple, Microsoft, and then Mozilla. And so the Apple and the Microsoft ones are actually quite good, but for copyright reasons cannot show them here. I'll link them. And I added the Mozilla ones because they are really in the realm of WebXR and this idea of bridging multiple devices and platforms. They're a little bit more technical as well, but I think together, comprehensively, quite a nice set of guidelines driven by vendors and device creators, and then also open standards initiatives and institutions like Mozilla. So the first example we're going to look at is here from the Oculus guidelines. And so I browsed and selected my device first. So let's say I'm going to develop for the Oculus Quest, and they're going to tell you a little bit about how rendering works, how stereoscopic images work, and then it says things like don't occlude the screen with the HUD. That makes a lot of sense. And don't draw HUD elements behind scene elements. So these are some really good tips, and this sometimes happens by accident. And then I think we're entering a very practical portion here where it talks about basically the field of view and how vision works, and both the horizontal, so the horizontal field of view, and the vertical field of view that we have, and where we see best and what's really a good area. And then I think those guidelines focused on hand tracking are really a part where the Oculus guidelines stand out. So let's focus on these a little bit and explore them in more depth. So here you see a concept video of how the App Store might work, where you're exploring one of the games like Beat Saber here using hand interaction. And then they're talking a little bit about the principles behind hand-based interaction. And they're using terms that I like, obviously, informed by Don Norman. So affordances, signifiers, and feedback, some of the core design principles that we often teach, or at least hear about when it comes to user experience and interaction design. For example, then talking about how to constrain inputs to improve usability, so the degrees of freedom, which can actually be very useful, but sometimes you don't want to move objects along all axes, and talking about some of those things. Also sending this reminder that hands aren't controllers, and so you should design differently for hands if you previously did controller-based VR interaction, then there's quite a few things you need to adapt. And really cool illustrations here. So overall, quite a few helpful tips and very useful illustrations. talking about both their principles and interaction styles, and then also talking about user interface components, really bringing it down from the theory to the practice, and then specifically for the Oculus platform, which I think is pretty useful, even though it is obviously vendor driven and platform driven. Many of these things could still translate to other platforms as well. So our next example is augmented reality guidelines from Google, AR Core. I really like those because really useful illustrations and to the point, telling us a little bit about how AR Core works and how to think about environmental limitations, both in terms of like obstacles that could be there for users and also where the platform has trouble actually detecting and recognizing different types of surfaces. So sometimes to do with lighting or reflection, really that makes it hard. And then a few practical tips regarding how to design an AR experience. Are you designing for tabletop? Are you designing for a room scale or a world scale experience? And then ideas of how to promote interactions and communicate where interactions can take place. So surface detection and visualizing surfaces, and then also adapting to the available play area, talking about how to promote users' exploration and potentially having fun, talking about different types of movement, and how you actually have control a little bit through visual cues. You really have, even though obviously AR and VR are really about agency and giving autonomy to users, as a designer you still have a lot of influence over how users move and interact, and you can drive that through visual cues and audio cues. And you can also combine these in useful ways to address accessibility issues. And as I said, safety and comfort is really at the core of most guidelines. And what I like here about some of the ones from Google is that they illustrate really to the point. Like, what are the things you want to avoid? Don't have people move backwards, for example. And talking about realism and how to achieve more realism through modeling, texturing, and then material design. Really good tips also for XR designers who don't necessarily have a 3D design and modeling background. Cool examples in comparison, so really quite useful reference here in terms of design guidelines and to the point. Our next example is a specification and some guidelines around WebXR, in this case authored and edited by Mozilla. And so the WebXR specification is still evolving, and even when you look at this draft, you will still find portions that are unwritten, but really useful illustrations around how tracking works, how headsets for VR work, stereoscopy, and designing for virtual reality and physical risks. So motion sickness, or virtual reality sickness they call it here, and physical risks. And earlier versions of these guidelines had really concrete values in terms of like where you should place, for example, text, and really emphasizing the fact that you shouldn't move the virtual camera unless the user really wants it, and then thinking about fading in and out to or blurring the periphery in order to reduce motion sickness. What I really like about this document here is the approach it takes towards cross-platform and thinking about both AR and VR, and then coming down to basically what's common, which is virtual cameras, and how you manipulate the view, and how you can basically achieve kinds of effects that are similar to filmmaking with good illustrations, so it actually helps us understand a lot of the material better. So I think this is a unique aspect to some of these guidelines. A little technical maybe for the taste of some designers, but overall I'd say pretty good and still evolving guidelines, helpful for cross-platform, web-based AR and VR. So this is going to be a very useful resource for us in the future as well. So these were just three examples, one from Oculus focused on VR, and one from Google AR Core focused on smartphone-based, handheld AR, markerless in this case. And then also an example from Mozilla, which is really at this intersection of platforms and focused more on the WebXR standard, and as I said, a little bit more technical. So just reviewing these guidelines, we can see a lot of the interesting challenges that there are right now about these guidelines. These were all relatively practical and to the point examples. I've seen a lot more vague guidelines. So here's the trouble that I have with a lot of the XR design guidelines. And again, keep in mind that I showed some really good examples here, so I'm not critiquing those specifically. At the core, we really don't have established best practices. They are actually really rapidly evolving still. XR design is still a moving target, lots to still learn about it. There's a lot of research and design going on in the space. We only have very slowly emerging, if at all, design patterns. And then those patterns really often change with a new OS update. I've seen this with Oculus multiple times, for example. And then we already have major differences between device platforms. So even when you look at VR devices and compare Oculus and Vive guidelines, or when you look at AR guidelines and look at the Apple ones and the Google ones for ARKit and AR Core, you really see quite a big gap and major differences between some of these platforms. So not only between AR and VR as platforms, but also between different vendors and providers. At the core, however, they all agree that obviously designing for comfort and safety is really, really important. So I would say there is a problem still with scoping guidelines. Just in the examples I shared, some of them were quite technical, so the Oculus and the Mozilla ones. The ones from Apple and the ones from Google were a little bit more high level, like keep the user safe and comfortable. That's not, I mean, they then went into some of the detail. So this is more like a principle than a guideline. And so overall, it's a little tricky at the moment to figure out really what's the best way to scope and present guidelines. Many of them are to application or device or vendor specific. So in the absence of a lot of really clear and established guidelines, I would just say that the best guidelines come from learning by doing. And it is really important that you test your designs early and often and learn from your own mistakes. Realize that you made a mistake when you test it with users. And then I think at the core, it's still important to mind the differences between VR and AR. So really designing a virtual world, but still taking care of the physical world, and then augmenting, enhancing the virtual world with AR. And maybe less of a focus on the differences between specific devices and vendors. In the end, we really need to figure out what are the good things to do in VR and what are the good things to do in AR, and what should we really avoid. So keeping with this idea of learning by doing, I wanted to add two more examples here. One is actually taking some of the Google AR design guidelines and putting it into AR, allowing you to explore in situ, basically in front of you, what some of these guidelines actually mean. It's an interesting example of storytelling in AR and for the purpose of learning and educating designers, so I really like it. Here, for example, illustrating nicely the differences between table scale, room scale, and then world scale. Okay. And how to communicate the size or the scale of the experience already in the App Store so that people know before they download and run an app. And then how to deal with the size of objects and how, this is really quite a cute example with his dinosaur that constantly wants your attention. But I mean, it's really hard to keep him in view, him or her. And so they also talk about how to use the size of objects and the fact that parts of them are hidden to encourage users to move around and explore more of the AR experience. They also show how to design a multiplayer AR experience and what to pay attention to. And here I really had to, I just like couldn't really see what they were doing on their smartphones, these two characters. So I had to interfere a little bit and go in there. In the end, turned out they were playing chess and they were exchanging spatial anchors as a form of calibration to agree on a shared coordinate system. And that's something they'll tell you about, and I think it's really quite cool. So it's really a playful way of exploring design guidelines and actually seeing the effect as you're learning about these guidelines. So I really like how they have taken these guidelines that we browsed earlier and looked at on the screen, and now we can learn about it in the world. Now here's the example with this idea of promoting users' movement, allowing them to explore more and creating enticing, captivating, immersive AR experiences just through the size of objects. And this froggy is really quite cute. So another great way to learn about XR design is through some of the examples that are out there. So here we're looking at the hand interactions example as part of the mixed reality toolkit from Microsoft. And so I think it's just great to see an example of all the kinds of widgets and how to design a scene and lay it out in front of the user, and then label each of these widgets and going through all the design options. So these examples are super practical, especially when it comes to digital prototyping and implementation. So even more concrete than some of the previous examples. So this is also focused on hand interactions and really telling you all about the different kinds of ways in which we can use hand interactions to support zoom and scrolling, and then translation of objects, and then hand tracking also to play the piano, although that experience is not as great as it looks because it's really lacking the tangible aspect and haptic feedback. It's great to see those examples of buttons and relatively common user interface widgets like the slider here and the buttons earlier. So it's really great to see how the hand interactions can be configured, and then how, for example, a 3D model like the Earth and Earth's core here can be annotated with labels and what that would look like. And it's really a nice little scene that allows us to explore various examples, including traditional buttons and more Unity user interface examples that would also work, but they really feel quite different. And just seeing them mixed in here also suggests to designers, well, first of all, this is possible, but second of all, the experience is quite different and maybe you should not mix them. Although this is a little bit implicit and probably more based on my experience than explicitly stated in this example. Anyway, it's a great example for us to learn and explore, just like the one I showed earlier, Google's AR Elements that you can run on your smartphone, and this one here runs on HoloLens 2, the Mixed Reality Toolkit hand interactions example. So having those pre-built scenes and examples is just a very good way to learn about AR, VR design. So over the past few years, I've really worked on quite a few AR and VR projects, and I was thinking about what kinds of guidelines could I share with you, my attempt of making it concrete and hopefully useful and less vendor and platform specific and more focused on really the issues that I see in XR design. And I've classified it into the do's and the don'ts, and we're going to go over them. So here they are. Really, it's like a list. You can just explore it, and I'll walk you over each of these issues. So first I talk about offer alternative ways to travel. So what I mean by this is, like, for example, allowing users to travel to places through a menu, or through gaze-based interaction by clicking locations in the world and landmarks, or different kinds of teleportation. But what you should really try to avoid is to move users without their input. So you should really not move them unless they indicated they want to be moved. It would feel really awkward. The other thing that's also weird is if the virtual character is moving and the user is actually sitting, so it really conflicts with proprioception, so our understanding of what our nerves and senses are actually doing. I think you should use interface metaphors as much as possible, but you should also pay attention to using modern interface metaphors. It's really important not to try to reinvent reality. So I know the idea of virtual reality is sometimes to port you into this completely different space, but if that space doesn't adhere to physics and any kinds of things that we know from the real world, what's the point of calling it a virtual reality? Now, you can actually change gravity and all those kinds of aspects, but the basic laws of physics should still apply. It should still feel like a world that is known to us and familiar to us. I think you should also make as much use as possible of physical affordances to really communicate to users how they can pick up an object and whether an object can be moved, rotated, and scaled or not. I think after pickup, obviously providing feedback, but these initial physical affordances are really important to allow users to confidently explore an AR or VR scene. I would caution and advise against this idea of making it a copy of the real world. So an example I share with you later is stairs. So I've really thought a lot about why we have stairs in virtual reality, for example. I mean, we can teleport, we can use a menu to get to places. Why do we have stairs? And I think it has to do with this idea of physical affordances to communicate to us. There is actually a level that you can go up or down, and just helps us read the space and understand the environment. So I get that. But really think about the amount of stairs we need to navigate, and that stairs are actually really not accessible in the virtual world and also not in the physical world, as you know. You should minimize or reduce the amount of required explicit interactions. So a user doesn't really want to have to speak a lot of voice commands, or repeatedly perform a very specific set of gestures. I think the hand interaction example I just showed from the HoloLens Mixed Reality Toolkit 2, I think it's great because there's a lot of implicit camera-based interactions, and then grabbing a slider and then moving it, but being able to going out of that position, so not having to hold it and just continue. I think those are great examples of reducing ergonomic effort on users, so I think that is really important. Also, don't rely on gestures or speech. So I've seen a lot of user interfaces where everything was gesture-based and no way of using speech, or the other way around, where everything was voice-based commands, and then some of the more traditional gestures that you would expect for scaling, rotating, etc. elements didn't work. So the challenge is really to find the balance between explicit and implicit interactions, and then also within the explicit interaction space, the amount of gestures, speech, and multimodal. So I think that's still quite a challenge. So here's a relatively standard one, but I think it's important. Put important elements in the foreground, avoid the periphery. And so many people talk about this. I really just think it's 2D screen-based design, you put everything that's important above the fold, you lose people the more they have to scroll in interfaces. And this applies to AR, VR as well. Really don't have users read a lot of text, and I'm going to come back to that one because I think it's fundamental, and I'll show you examples of how bad this actually is in AR and in VR. Provide visual and audio cues to guide users through tasks. So don't just rely on one sense, really use this mix. I've seen a lot of VR experiences that are really visual and no audio, and audio makes such a big difference. On the AR side, if you're working on a smartphone, users often choose to maybe mute their phones, so maybe not as important. But in general, I think you should aim again for this mix, and having both types of cues really influence how users navigate and interface and operate an interface. And finally, but this one should be relatively clear anyway, but it still happens. I've seen it in a lot of interfaces. So don't remap the controller buttons just because the interface is now in a different mode. It's really difficult for users to relearn all the functions and then remember which mode they're in. And really try to avoid breaking any kinds of design conventions or going against mainstream unless you're really confident about your design choice, in which case I would encourage you to go about it and maybe you revolutionize design that way. But most of the time, it really doesn't actually support design and makes it really hard for users as well. So we've covered a lot of the do's and don'ts based on my experience, and that experience is coming from doing a lot of research in that space and then also teaching a lot of students about XR design and obviously operating a lot of AR, VR applications myself. But while I strongly believe that these are good guidelines, it's just a starting point. It's just based on my experience, and maybe there are people out there that disagree. But overall, as a starting point, I think you can apply those guidelines. Look at your designs and then look at these guidelines as a checklist and see how many do's you have done and how many don'ts you have done, and then think about ways of avoiding the don'ts, which I think might be a good way to improve design. So still thinking about design guidelines, I wanted to look at an example, and I chose a recent experience that I had when I was attending the IEEE Virtual Reality Conference in 2020, which was supposed to happen in Atlanta, but due to COVID-19 had to move to remote and online. And we're going to look at some of their spaces that they have created, some of the virtual environments that they have created. And I have invited my student here, Shweta, who is going to join me in some of these discussions and explorations as well. And a couple of the things we're going to do is we're going to climb some stairs, which I think leads to interesting issues. We're going to explore the world, going for a walk together, and then you will also see me picking avatars and looking at a lot of text. And then we're going to review some of the design decisions, and I'm going to compile a few more tips and maybe guidelines, if you will, to also avoid those things in the future. So here I'm looking down the venue. This is the stage that they have, and I'm waiting for my student Shweta. There she is, and I see her, and I can see how she is essentially trying to make her way up. So they have designed this stage so that you start in the back where you have a little bit of privacy. In some sense, you don't hear the speakers and can have a chat, and then others won't hear you in that area if they're up here on that stage. So that's good, but you then actually have to climb those stairs, and these stairs are really not accessible no matter whether using a keyboard and mouse like I do here in this example, or a VR headset, which I'll do in some of the other examples in the future. So stairs really is an interesting issue to me, and something we should think about more and potentially avoid as much as possible. And so then I was thinking, okay, let's explore a little bit more of this venue. And I decided, we were attending this conference for a while, and then I said to Shweta, hey, why don't we go for a walk and explore some of their bigger virtual spaces. And so we ended up on this Georgia Tech campus. Now, I haven't actually been to the Georgia Tech campus, so I don't know how much it really resembles reality. But I could imagine that unless they had a major investment, it probably doesn't look like this. So in many ways, they reinvented reality here and that makes sense. I mean, I guess. I mean, the big B and some of these virtual screens floating around. So it's an interesting mix of, like, this is a selfie from Blair, one of the organizers, and a friend who I hope doesn't mind that I'll critique and review this a little bit to look at our guidelines and which of these can apply. And then we were going for a walk, and there were some issues. Again, it's a ramp here, it's not stairs, but I could teleport with my mouse pretty easily, and then Shweta was using a MacBook and didn't have right click, so she couldn't actually navigate the space with mouse and teleport, so I had to walk all the way. And for a novice user, Shweta is not a novice user, but for somebody who explores such a world and VR for their first time, figuring out how to move in a space when it's unclear and that you have this option potentially of teleporting if it's available, that is actually really quite an important step. And obviously the more experience you have in these spaces, the more of that experience translates between spaces and experiences, and so maybe it won't be so much of an issue later. But onboarding is really quite difficult still. And then this is really, it's an interesting example, because I really don't get a good sense of what the Georgia Tech campus looks like, apart from a few billboards and text here. And now that text is okay. The way it's placed is actually quite well done. It's on a billboard, it has sufficient contrast, it's not just floating. I'll have another example later that I think is pretty bad. Then we were walking around a little bit more, exploring some of the other spaces, ending up at a campfire, which was really quite an interesting atmosphere. The way you navigate those spaces was interesting. So one of these tiles was actually a portal into a different world. So there's a little bit of inconsistency here in terms of the content that you see on the walls. So some of it is actually video, some of it is text, and some of this can be played, I guess, or not. So it's really quite a lot of stuff going on. And then, as I said, one of those tiles actually functions as a portal into different spaces. So I do like that they illustrate a lot of the content here and some of the hard work that really went behind creating this experience and this online conference, essentially. So why did I pick this example? Because I think it really allows us to review some of the guidelines, this idea of not really copy-pasting reality, offering alternative ways of navigating, making use of established interface metaphors, and limiting the amount of explicit interaction. And I was really stuck on the stairs example and the platform that I was talking about, just because while it was good in terms of physical affordances, that I understood that I can get to a different part of this virtual world and I can navigate up and down or further away. It really reintroduced all these known accessibility issues from the physical world, and that's just like a big problem in an experience like this. So when you go to a conference like this, you really want to learn what kinds of things are actually available, what sessions are on. And also here they kind of replicated the real world, which usually you have some kind of handout or some kind of boards. And somebody from the community created this room, essentially putting these program information sheets into the virtual world here. But it's really a lot of text and hard to navigate, to the extent that I'm like almost bumping into it. And it really wasn't that helpful after all. The main purpose was not to have to leave the virtual reality experience. It was a quick fix because a lot of people felt like, oh, I'll always have to jump back to the virtual reality website, and but I just want this information in VR. So transitioning in and out of VR is still an issue, and it's very disruptive to the user experience. So I get it. But the way we deal with text here is not ideal. So why do I say this? I want to show you two examples. One is in VR and one is in AR. And we're going to talk about the format and the layout of the text. And I'm just using some standard text with as little format and layout as possible. And then I'll show you the different experiences in VR and AR. So my first example is lorem ipsum larem placeholder text in VR, and I just really placed it into the scene, and you can see it in stereoscopic view here, and it's really hard for me to actually view it at any one time. And then this idea of using your hands and fingers as reading aid only partially works with this really big VR controller here. Now that may improve a little bit with hand tracking, but it's still kind of an issue. So here I'm showing you an augmented reality example where I inserted the same text in the studio, and there happens to be this light source that I obviously need to lit the scene and make sure that you can see me on camera. But and this could be just the sun in the real world. It really introduces a lot of issues with reading this text and just seeing it. So really you need to pay attention to the environment, both the virtual and the physical. The distance of the text is kind of okay. I put it at 1 meter away. It shouldn't be further away than 2 meters, is what people say. The scale is still a little big for my taste, but if I scale it down, it really introduces new issues. So text in general, there is no really good solution. It would need to be adaptive, I guess, and know a lot about the user and maybe their prescription and all kinds of things. So just try to avoid it. And again, reading aids here, like using my finger. My finger appears behind the screen just because we don't actually, in this example, have finger-based or a hand occlusion and figure-based occlusion. Now we're getting there and improving some of this, but it's not available on all platforms. And even then, I don't think this part of improving the technology would actually solve the issue. So my last example is avatars. So let's think about the design space that we have in terms of avatars. I show two examples here. One is with permission from my friend Jeremy Nelson, who appears in his kind of like reconstructed avatar. All he did was upload a photo to spatial and meeting kind of software. So that's what you see on the right. And then on the left, you see some of the avatars that are used, for example, in Mozilla Hubs, and those are the ones that I chose from when I was actually going to the IEEE VR conference. So when you compare those types of avatars, you definitely see that the ones on the left are more abstract but appear to be more consistent, and the one on the right are more realistic. But there were some issues with the scale and the position of Jeremy. So he appeared in my desk, for example, and I always looked down on him, which normally isn't the case. We are almost the same height, so it was a little disturbing and confusing. Now these things will probably be improved in the future, but sometimes the more abstract avatars are actually just good enough, and we don't necessarily need to recreate the whole reality just because we have all these tracking issues, which are then even worse. The closer you are into reality, the higher your expectations are, and the more disruptive the user experience is if something goes wrong. You know, if this little avatar on the left doesn't move properly, that's weird, but it's okay. But if Jeremy's arms or legs bend in a weird way, you don't want to imagine that. So here I'm going to show an example of where I chose my avatar and wasn't happy initially. I was going to this conference. It was a little funny because I did spend quite some time on my outfit and choosing. There was one particular character I was looking for. It was kind of like this Iron Man looking metal guy, and I think I found him on the last page, but this was probably the closest, or it wasn't available. That was also disappointing, that an avatar that I used to use was not available in this specific experience, and so it really, in terms of consistency, was a little disruptive. So these were some of the examples that I put together for you to illustrate some of the guidelines. I didn't have an example for each and every guideline, but take a look at them, explore them in a little bit more detail, and again, as I said, use them as a checklist to understand and identify opportunities for improvement to your XR designs. And again, treat them as a starting point. Maybe you disagree, that's fine. Maybe you have a particular example where this guideline doesn't really apply, so the rule doesn't apply. But I think it's important that we have some kind of guidelines. These are the ones that formed in my head over a few years of working with novice designers, particularly students, and then also based on my own experience, like going to this IEEE VR conference. And I don't want to be too negative. Obviously, it was a cool experience. But as a designer, when you look at some of the artifacts created that way, like the virtual environments that we looked at, and really they didn't have a lot of time. They had to put this together very quickly, and I assume little user testing, and then working with this new medium in VR for conferences is still pretty new. So all that is obviously clear, so I'm not attacking them in that way. It's just a great example to study how much do you want to push the realism and this trade-off between making it like a reality and then all the issues that come with it when you don't actually live up to that expectation, when you actually break the illusions, be it through your design and some shortcomings of it, or maybe issues with the technology like limited tracking or other kinds of issues. So I'm going to leave this video a little bit more open-ended just because I do think that these guidelines still need to evolve. And at least now we have a way to think about guidelines and how to assess the source of guidelines and when they apply and don't apply. So I'm going to leave you there and think about the stairs, which still I think it is fascinating to me. And if you get to this stage where you start obsessing about some of these design decisions and why things are there, so questioning some of the design decisions, then I think it shows that you're starting to think critically about design, and that is a really good thing, and it would make me proud if that's what I have accomplished today with this lecture. In this video, we're going to talk about XR design jams. Now, design jams are like hackathons, just that they don't last like an entire weekend or whatever you may have heard of hackathons. In my mind, a design jam is like coming together, solving a design task collaboratively over the time span of perhaps like 3 hours. And it's actually really a cool activity. Now, the key idea behind design jams is to bring together stakeholders that might benefit from whatever it is that you're designing. So these stakeholders include some of your target users, but also maybe members of your design team as well. In fact, I've done some of the coolest design jams in my own research and also work as a professor, so in the classroom, when I've actually involved other clients and members of my own research team. So pretty cool. And that's what we're going to learn about today. I'm going to share a few lessons. I'm going to talk about both from the perspective of planning and running a design jam, and then also participating in a design jam. So we're still exploring how to do XR design, and I've already covered design guidelines and critiques. And now we're talking about design jams, and design jams are really about getting your hands dirty, and so creating your own XR designs. That's what we're going to talk about. So, as I said, I've done a lot of design jams in my research in the past. So this is one of the first ones I've done when I joined the University of Michigan. It was around a project called Proto-AR. I really wanted to learn how to make design jams more physical and bring AR/VR into design jams and actually provide also digital tools that help the students transition more quickly from physical, so from paper to digital, so into a tool called Proto-AR. And I'll link it in the references and resources. If you want, you can read about it. There's a paper about it as well. So, but that's just one project. We've, over the years, used it in many different ones. So this one is 360 Proto, which is essentially a follow-up of Proto-AR. So the idea was to still build this system that would help designers create interactive AR/VR prototypes now using paper. Just paper and specific templates. And so this design jam then, for example, involved paper prototyping and then also AR/VR devices directly. As you can see here, a preview on a Google Cardboard. So basically you just take a picture of your prototype on the left that you see on the left, and then it'll appear in your smartphone when you put it into a Google Cardboard. And we've also used design jams to design more complex systems together with students and also clients. I show here an example where we invited students. Actually, all of these students then ended up working in my research labs. So it's also a very powerful and useful recruiting tool to actually attract new talent to your research or design teams. So let's try to define design jams a little bit. What are the main ingredients? So whenever I design a design jam, I think of the goals. The tasks, so really what do I want my participants to do, what do we want to learn about, what should they deliver. So each of these tasks should somehow lead to a clearly specified deliverable. Which kinds of AR, VR devices are we going to involve, what tools do I provide to my participants, so is it just physical materials like paper, transparency, cardboard, Play-Doh, those are tools. Is it specific paper templates, still tools, or is it any kind of digital tools and then paired with some kind of devices, for example? And finally, also how much time should we spend? So you should really structure it Even 3 hours, even though 3 hours sounds like a very long time, this is actually over very quickly. If you do a good design jam, the participants will feel very productive and have a lot of fun. And actually, oftentimes in my classes when I ran design jams, students just didn't want to go home. So that's a cool little side effect as well. So what I thought I'd share is a little bit of a photo story here of a design jam that we've run. So this is the one around Proto-AR that you can read about, as I said. And the way I describe it in the research paper is obviously quite different because the focus of the research was somewhere else. But here you see the typical elements like storyboards, and then we're becoming increasingly physical and mixing in Play-Doh, and then Play-Doh to create 3D models and basically creating 3D scenes. And the task here was to design a furniture placement app similar to IKEA Place. And we also essentially primed the students by showing them existing apps that are similar to what we had in mind. And you get a lot of really cool assets that way, including, for example, really nice furniture. This sofa, even though it's miniature, still has a very special place in our lab. So now I'm going to take the perspective of an organizer of a design jam, and then later I'm going to talk about what it's like more if you're participating in a design jam. So let's talk about planning design jams first. So the first thing I always do is actually I start by thinking about who should participate. Who am I actually designing this design jam for? Obviously you can make it open for everyone, but a focus group approach, so really like being more selective in terms of like what kind of experience do you want your participants to have, how broad and diverse should it be, or should it target specific technical skills or specific domains. That is going to really significantly impact how the whole design jam is going to go and the data and the results that it's going to produce. I also think about what happens before the design jam and then also after the design jam. Obviously, most of my tips will be about the during, so while you're doing the design jam, but it's important to really think about, are there any tasks that participants should do before or even after design jams? So as an example, you might ask participants to fill in a background questionnaire before or after a design jam so that you can focus the design jam time really on the actual prototyping. And if you do it before, it can also be a recruitment tool that way and allow you to select participants. You should really think about the data you want to collect about your participants, and I usually treat design jams part of my research projects, and therefore I get IRB approval. And so it's very important to think about what kind of data you're going to collect and how you're going to protect the rights of your participants, how you're going to de-identify and anonymize data, etc. And while the design jam should feel like a really fun activity, there could still be a relatively strict protocol behind the scenes to make sure that you're doing it in a rigorous way. So then, and now we're getting closer to the event, and how do I actually now make sure that everybody I bring in, if it's a rather diverse pool of participants, how do I make sure that everybody is on the same page? And the way I usually do this is I usually start a design jam off by showing something to participants, giving a demo of some kind of AR or VR technology so that they have at least seen it, or a specific type of AR or VR application, and sometimes really even an authoring tool if you're trying to critique something there. So in your case, if you already have something designed, that could be the starting point of the design jam. And you should really provide references and any kinds of materials to participants so that they can refer back to it, because sometimes not everything is clear in the beginning, and then the questions really come throughout the design jam, so it's important to be able to actually go back and have access to those materials. Speaking of materials, it's very important to organize all the materials that you anticipate participants will need to have them ready for them. So you actually have a lot of influence over how efficiently and effectively participants will be able to participate and contribute. And so that is really the key here. So from doing a lot of design jams, I realized I really have a lot of influence on how quickly and effectively participants are going to navigate the tasks. And so it's really good to plan upfront and have those materials ready for them. So for example, here are all the materials that we provided to participants for this furniture placement in AR design jam. So there was plain paper, no particular templates, but we encouraged participants to think about the scenarios and sketch out storyboards and wireframes. But again, no particular templates at that point yet. And then after some period in the design jam, we introduced Play-Doh so that participants were more focusing their attention on creating and crafting 3D models using Play-Doh, not actual 3D modeling tools, and that allowed everybody to bring in their fun, childhood fun experience, if you will. And what's really fascinating to observe in that particular design jam was how participants were able to do the 3D modeling in parallel to some of the discussion around how to design this mobile AR app. And most of the discussion was really about user flow and how to transition between screens. And so 3D modeling, if you have ever done it, it is actually a really intense task. It's not something you usually do in parallel to discussing some of the other key things. So that was quite fascinating in this design jam. And it's one of those examples that I'd like to share because it really shows the value of design jams to me. This is something I didn't anticipate in advance. I really had a dedicated time slot for 3D modeling with Play-Doh, and then it just like naturally flew into some of the other activities. And so we just let it happen. So this was already leading into the running design jams a little bit. I'm going to give you a few tips here. So I think it's important to start by giving a problem statement. You really don't want your participants to spend most of their time trying to clarify what it is that you want them to do and what the problem really is. And so the problem framing shouldn't be left to them. It should actually be given to them. I think this will save a lot of time and potentially also frustration among participants. And believe me, I'm speaking from experience here because I've made that mistake before. For example, when I was running the Kai 2019 AR VR prototyping design jam, we were designing a remote conference experience app, thinking about AR and VR. And then most of the discussions were like about the tasks and whether remote attendance is actually something that is meaningful and useful, because the community and the participants were from that community. They were really torn and split whether you should go in person or should attend remotely. And I should have anticipated that beforehand, but I really didn't. And so I feel like I should have said, okay, imagine Kai is going to be remote, and this is what we're designing for. Bam, and there you go. And associated with that is this next really important tip, which is having a clear design prompt. Make it short and precise. Definitely leave room for novelty and creativity, but also challenge your participants. And then it's very important throughout the design jam to really use a consistent structure. So for each activity, start with a goal, provide participants with a description of each task that they should be doing, unless the approach that they choose is part of what you're trying to figure out. So maybe then you can leave it a little bit loosely specified, but you should really still clearly specify the deliverables. So in a lot of my design jams, the primary deliverable at the end is some kind of video that talks about the evolution and maybe the final prototypes that came out, and maybe also some of the design thinking that went behind it. But what I really hope to see in these videos is some kind of creativity and original thinking and a prototype that helps me imagine what the participants were envisioning. So now that we have specified the problem, gave them a clear prompt, and we have paid attention to a consistent structure throughout, at the end of the design jam, it's also really important to think about what kind of feedback do you want to collect from participants. There should be normally some kind of debriefing. I often do some kind of discussion round in combination maybe with a more individual feedback questionnaire, so that participants can answer questions and also share their experience and maybe make suggestions for improvement, because I often run design jams multiple times with different participants, and so I can improve iteratively basically the design jam as its own little design and design product. Throughout the design jam, I think from a facilitation perspective, it's very important that you don't just do it by yourself. You have a little bit of a team. I often work with students and research assistants, and they help me with timekeeping and also answering questions and taking observational notes. So it's really important to plan this before you actually do it. So maybe do a dry run, and that can be a lot of fun, and you can figure out and iron out some of the issues. And then I said it's important to collect feedback. So I often design a one-page, that's important, feedback questionnaire, and I'll start with the questions that are most relevant to our project, in this case around the research that we were doing, and the demographic stuff I leave for later. You usually want to collect both types of information, but and then the middle portion here is really an opportunity to provide more open-ended feedback. But even with the open-ended feedback, I usually tell my participants how many items of feedback we are roughly looking for, so 2 pros, 2 cons of this experience, for example. So now we're switching perspectives, and now we're thinking about participating in design jams. Here's a few tips that I usually give my students in my classes, because obviously there's a lot of design jams out there, a lot of companies run design jams, and especially in the AR/VR space, and it's sometimes, as I said, used as a recruitment tool as well, so you really want to do well here. And so here I've collected a few tips through my own observations over the years, running lots of design jams, as I said, in research, in my lab, and then also in teaching in the classroom. I'm going to go quickly over each of these principles and almost read them out to you, but I think they should basically stand for themselves. Making a plan is crucial, so really distribute the rules and let them evolve, these rules, okay? Sketch to brainstorm. Don't just brainstorm, sketch. It's very important. I've seen a lot of design jams where basically you just talk, and nothing happens, nothing comes to paper. But paper is such an important medium to communicate ideas, so I really always emphasize this idea of sketching to ideate, not just brainstorming and thinking bubbles, which I cannot really see. Make use of space. So this is be physical, be visual, be creative. Divide the workload. So not everything has to be done in parallel. Try to identify opportunities to divide the labor and then maybe take turns so that nobody gets bored, and really use the facilitator. So one person that really pushes the team. Because most design jams are time limited and structured into several sections. So it helps to move forward and actually be efficient as a team. And then the key deliverables is something you should really decide on. So I'll list a few examples here, but not each of them are important. And if you have taken standard user experience design or interaction design classes, you really start with scenarios, personas, competitors. And yes, I've talked about that as well. But I think really just get down to sketching, quickly sort out your storyboards, maybe prototype something physically if you have the time. Do a digital prototype if that is something that would be of benefit and seems doable to you, but really be creative. And then, as I said, in most of my design jams, usually the product is a video. And that video, if you have a little bit of time for editing and cutting, not so much the music, but like really focusing on the details, so cutting off the things that would be distracting. Don't focus on nice video overlays and title slides and all this kind of stuff. No, keep it kind of so that it's like ad hoc. You feel like you're there, you're part of that experience, you see that prototype for yourself, even though it's just a video. So keep it dynamic and don't make it too professional. And then throughout the design jam, one of the really, really important things I cannot emphasize enough is that you should really experiment. Try out alternative design ideas. You can do this through parallel prototyping and then maybe choose some of the best ideas, but don't judge immediately. Let everybody see a little bit and come together. So these are some of the best ways I've seen teams organize themselves. And then When it comes to documenting design, you should really think of documenting the evolution. So don't just take the pictures at the end when you're like really proud of what you've accomplished and maybe you've won something and there's reasons to celebrate. Or even if you haven't won, there's always reasons to celebrate. So don't just take pictures at the end. And then this is like from the heart. But because I know that companies increasingly see value in design jams, so for example, at UMich and in my lab specifically, lots of companies approach us and want to work with me and my students. And the only way to really do well in these design jams is to practice, practice, practice. So participate in as many design jams as possible. And then in these design jams, don't treat it so much as a competitive kind of activity. Treat it as something collaborative and fun, and try to feel for the boundaries, or the end of the envelope, if you will, by soliciting feedback from other teams, basically your competitors, or maybe even some of the organizers. I think this can lead to really cool discussions. I usually observe it with students that they seem to be just focused on their teams. And but it's really actually cool to take a break and look around and see what others are working on, because a lot of the value from these design jams and the best results in these design jams don't just come from sticking within your team and sticking to that specific idea of yours, but kind of like seeing what the others are doing and incorporating some of these elements. Even though it feels like cheating, that's boring and that's creative, and so I wouldn't totally discourage it. So in summary, as a participant, here are a few things you could or really should do. So before you get started, make a little bit of a plan. Think about the time that you have, define your approach, maybe the roles in the team, and then also the milestones, your interpretation of the goals and deliverables. Really think about the scenarios, but maybe don't spend too much time writing them. Just like try to agree verbally or implicitly in some way with your team. So be clear on the users, the agents, and what they're doing. And then another thing that I often observe is then a lot of design prompts and design jam activities seem a little vague, and they're subject to interpretation. So rather than getting frustrated about that, you should see it as an opportunity to make decisions. Not assumptions, but decisions, and then clearly articulate why you have designed something this way, because you were designing for this type of persona or for this type of context, namely physical environment, etc. So make decisions in your scenarios and throughout all the activities. Yes, you could use personas, and if you do, then obviously they would just be used as a tool to communicate who you are designing for, and importantly, who you're not designing for. Storyboards, I think, are really key for that, and I'll show you in some of the physical prototyping activities. We actually have specific AR/VR templates, and I think it's often a good idea to use some templates, but then don't just fill in those templates, break out of those templates if it's justified by your design ideas, and push that creativity and novelty edge a little bit. Flesh out the most promising ideas and then really quickly transition into something that is more tangible, like a physical prototype or maybe even a digital prototype. The physical prototypes will allow you to quickly demo the envisioned interface and associated interactions, and the digital prototype will demonstrate feasibility if you're good with the tools. But I wouldn't just always jump into the digital prototyping, because it's often quite unrealistic to get a really robust and useful prototype. I would often favor the physical over the digital, especially in those design jams. So these were just a few concrete ideas and examples of what you could or should be doing. I think you should decide for yourself and with your team which of these you want to prioritize. You usually can't do all of them, but pick those that really help you learn the most about the problem and then also the solution. So the last thing I would like to say, I said I've used design jams a lot in my research, and every design jam has been different. And there is some kind of really creative part about that methodology that I like. It's very different from a lab-based user study or some kind of controlled experiment, and I really like that creative component, both in terms of like what the participants produce, but also how you run it. I think that's a very valuable part, and I think lots of interesting kinds of data usually come out of these design jams. So both the kinds of prototypes that participants have created, we have analyzed a lot of different ways and learned that way, what kinds of gestures, interactions, speech commands, how do they think about multi-modal interaction, how do they think about VR, how do they think about AR, should our prototype really be an AR or a VR prototype? So all these kinds of things you can really get out of these design jams. It's very, very useful. So think of them as a tool, embed them early and throughout the design of your project. I really can't get enough of design jams, and I hope that's a joy and a passion that you will share with me. In this video, we're going to talk about XR design critiques. So critiquing is a very, very important skill. Design critiques or crits are practiced in many areas, including in architecture. It's quite extensive here. For example, at the University of Michigan, can be quite heated discussion, you might say. It is usually a form of constructive criticism, so basically a thorough review, and you take into account design guidelines and your own experience of creating experiences in that sense. So we're going to talk about the critiquing part. I think the best designers are those that have a critical eye and can see issues in design. And seeing issues is actually really, that's easy. That's the easy part. Formulating a constructive critique that includes elements of improvement. So not just like no, but also here is a different way to think about it, or why don't you try this? So I'm going to introduce you to a little bit of that mindset that I adopt, even though I can actually be quite critical, but also with my own work. But I think ultimately the idea is to generate feedback. And so the other part of critique that we don't really talk so much about is, and that actually makes a very good designer as well, is the ability to address feedback and to react and respond to feedback. If you have access to a smartphone that is compatible with Google Cardboard or any derivatives, I'll show you a version of Cardboard that I'm using, which is actually made of plastic. Or you can use the AR mode. So Expeditions actually runs on both iOS and Android phones. So you do need a little bit of a later generation smartphone model here, but we should be able to work with Google Expeditions. So I'm going to do a critique now of Google Expeditions, and then I'm going to choose a few specific expeditions. I'm going to focus on VR. I'm going to talk a little bit about 360, so this ability to switch from VR to 360, which I think is actually a great feature. And then I'm going to talk about an AR exhibition, and these are just examples, but think of Expeditions as an app that can actually download different kinds of expeditions. These expeditions can be created by other vendors, so not just Google. And I think this should provide a playground for us to actually practice critiques. Expeditions as a tool has a relatively limited number of features, but it's interesting how these different expeditions implement it. And there are still better ways to do it, and then some not so good ways, and I'll point out some of the more common design issues that I saw across the board as examples. But let's just jump in and get started. Okay, in this video I'm going to do a quick review of Google Expeditions, and so I'm going to launch it here on my phone, and we're going to use Cardboard. And I don't have Cardboard with me right now, so we're going to use this version of Cardboard, which is a IM Cardboard plastic version of Cardboard, and it's really quite cool. So it's quite mobile, and that's it. It just goes onto my head like this. So I'm going to start Expeditions. I'm going to put it in there as the phone instructs me to do it, and there we are. And so now it actually looks really nice. I already have this dinosaur here and a really cool kind of like background image. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the downloaded tours for a sec. I have all these tours that I have downloaded here, and so quite a few. And the one that I wanted to do is the New York City tour. And so this is New York City, and you can see Manhattan here, and there are a couple of landmarks. So now we're looking at the One World Trade Center, which is the World Trade Center Memorial, and then this is the Woolworth Building. And as you move away, I like how it actually gives you these visual cues that you have to go back there to find the target. And we can continue the tour by looking at bridges. And now we're going to find the Manhattan Bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge that we're looking at. And then, so again, the visual cues are cool. And let us just explore something maybe out of sequence or order. But there don't seem to be too many landmarks in this scene. So let's just go to a different scene. So the way you switch scenes is this way. Now we're looking at Middle Upper Manhattan Island. We can scroll here and read more if you want. And Central Park South. Let's go there. That doesn't work. Okay, that one activated, and for some reason the other one didn't work. So let's see whether we can reach it by going next. Okay, it does work. Now that's a little uncomfortable, like so far down. And I mean, you can lean in, but obviously it's not tracked in 6 degrees of freedom, only 3 degrees of freedom. So you can't actually really. This is weird. This kind of like motion. And then the scene doesn't actually react to it, obviously, is a little uncomfortable. And there are other issues here. Sometimes when this other menu comes up, let's see, when does it? It's unclear how to bring up this menu is really unclear to me. And then it is always in the way somehow. It's interfering. So maybe. Again, I don't know how to bring up this menu, and I just know it happens sometimes. It comes, and it seems to happen when you move in a certain way. Anyway, and then you can explore different scenes here, and we get an overview of all the scenes. And we can. I didn't want to click this, so it was an accident. I actually wanted to click this thing, so I have to be careful because I know there is the sunset on the Hudson River one that I wanted to look at and show you. And this is quite a view, isn't it? It is really nice. It's good to have a swivel chair in order to explore this in a safe and fun way. So I wanted to interrupt this critique for a bit, and there was a think aloud, so you could listen to me as I was exploring the app, and I was pointing out some of the confusions I had, and when something was a misclick or I intended something else. So that's actually quite useful. Then this frustration about this menu that doesn't appear, and so I'm going to summarize some of the key issues that I've identified so far. And then we're going to look at a method to actually formulate a critique that starts with the positive and is a little bit more structured. So one thing I've talked about was a little bit of the menus, and that was okay. I mean, there were some issues there with accidentally not hitting this thing and then something else was triggered, but overall it was fine. I talked quite a bit about the menu and scrolling, and I think one of these items didn't work, but okay, that's also okay. And by the way, this is obviously captured in a stereoscopic view, and you could see a little bit of a shift here between the eyes, and that is necessary in order to give you this depth illusion. And then we have the barrel distortion that also adds to this effect of depth. So I was really pointed out quite a few times how I like all the visual cues, like these arrows. They point me towards the direction in which the landmark is that I'm looking for, so I really like that. What was completely absent was any kind of audio cues. I did have it enabled, but I didn't get the narrator to work. There's a narration function in there, so I skipped that part. Maybe it'll work for you. And then I did like the visual targets and then how the content was placed to it. So, and I pointed out a few more issues, but so let's look at how we can critique better to organize our thoughts a little bit. And so I'm going to introduce you to a template that I often use, and it's actually quite popular. It's used in a lot of design thinking classes, also heavily used in Stanford, where I think it originated, and it's often used in user experience and interaction design classes. So that template is I like, I wish, what if. And it works as follows. You start with what you like about a design, and you really limit it to the top 2 things and really point out something that doesn't feel like you just say something nice to say something nice. No, really pick something that you think that is cool, something that inspired you, something that you would adopt and incorporate into your own practice. I think that makes it a very good way to start a critique. And then you have to transition over into the actual critique, so the criticism portion of the critique, and this is the I wish portion. So what could be improved? Again, focus on 2, don't go forever, don't make it outweigh everything you have talked about when you liked things. Don't use the I like thing to get quickly into the negative. So whenever I go to conferences, it's like, thank you for your presentation, but have you thought about BAM? And so that's like not a good way. This is a standard way of starting a critique, but it's actually quite annoying and it's not really useful. So pick something that you like and then transition over into something that you think needs to be improved. And it's not only because you think that, there should be guidelines or any kind of best practice that you can refer to. Maybe you've read something, maybe there's a scholar who wrote about this, and that gives your critique more credibility, and I think that's important as well. And you should really then come up with ways of improving it, not just saying what needs to be improved, but also suggesting how it can be improved. So that is the what if component, and here I usually still ask for 2. So when I do this in class, and have students present XR interfaces or whatever interfaces to each other. I've done this for many years now. It is often in the form of written feedback, so I have like little paper sheets with just this, asking for 2 likes, so for 2 pros, 2 cons, and 2 suggestions for improvement. And the last part is the one that I think is the most important, but doesn't always receive enough attention. The middle portion always seems to go really well. And the first one I don't think is as strong as I wished it would be. So really a strong I like, a good I wish, and a really strong what if. That is how you should balance those things. It's really important. Have you tried this? Why don't you try this? I think this could work. And offer some insights and suggestions why you think it might work. Okay, so let's apply this method to the Google Expeditions example that I just showed, and let's try to be quick and like really rapid critique. I like, I wish, what if. So here we go. I like that the visual cues help me find landmarks. This is really good. There was a lack of audio cues, but I didn't say that. I wouldn't say that at this time. I just say I like that the visual cues help me find landmarks. And I also like that the main menu allows me to switch scenes. I think that is a very good way. Now I wish that the affordances and visual feedback and menus were a little bit clearer. So I wished for affordances and visual feedback in menus. I mean, there is something, but it's not enough. And then I also wished there were another way to trigger that main menu. I really just couldn't figure it out. As you could watch me do it, you noticed some of my frustration as well. And so what if? So what if we're going to do the following? We're going to have hot areas around the menu items were marked. So I even suggested that here in a little design improvement, and I think that's a good what if. You could sketch out an improvement, or maybe with a little bit of image manipulation, which I did here, just using some basic overlays. You could suggest how to change the design. And what if the main menu appeared on click and there were no collisions? That would be a great improvement. And the no collisions part, we could maybe figure out where other menus are and make sure that they are not overlapping each other, because that does happen quite a bit. And it can be a little annoying because you don't know which of the menus will actually trigger. It's not always obvious. And keep in mind that we don't actually have a z-axis we can work with. So this is 3 degrees of freedom, so you really just have head rotation. That's all you have. And so you leaning in or out doesn't make a difference. And if this were supported on cardboard, then maybe we could work around the issues with these overlays and the menus. But as it stands, it's an issue, and here are some ways of addressing it. Now I'm going to jump back and continue with a little bit of that example, and I'm going to point out some other features that I think are cool. And I'm not going to do this same I wish, what if method again, but you could imagine doing that yourself. And after the 360 view that I'll introduce you to, I'm also going to show you a few AR examples. And then you could imagine the I wish, what if part. But I think it's just maybe valuable for you to see how I explore the interface and how I critique things as I go. The other thing that this app actually supports, which I think is also pretty cool, is get out of the cardboard VR mode. Let's just put this away for a sec. And then we have a button that essentially gets out of the stereoscopic view and just brings us into a 360 view. And now we can just look around and still enjoy the sunset. And interestingly, so it doesn't work as, it doesn't feel as nice as the VR experience, but it kind of still works. And the nice thing about it is that it remembers states, so you're still in the same scene, you still have the same landmarks activated, and the interactions are still really the same. The text is a little harder to read because everything is a little smaller now. This kind of navigation still works. Still feels awkward to look down onto an object like that, and this transition is how am I supposed to do this transition? Okay, and now I swivel too much, and somebody might feel sick that way. So it's interesting how you navigate these scenes. I would say overall it is a cool experience. There's a lot of expeditions you can explore. I chose the World Cities one here in New York as one example. In the exercise, we're also going to look at the AR version of it, which I think is also pretty cool. Can't do the same expeditions in AR and VR, so I haven't found one that is both available in AR and in VR. But the framework around it, the tool, expeditions as a tool, or the app around it, is interesting how it works to compare it in AR and in VR. If you only have AR or VR available, so VR, in this case, through a form of cardboard. If you only have one of them available, probably AR is going to be possible for you. Then I would recommend that you explore some of the expeditions and do a design critique of how it is designed, and well, try to apply some of the guidelines, and then also look at it from an ethics perspective. Those are some of the steps we want to do in some of the exercises. So this should be fun, and I hope you learn a lot. And I think there are obviously other applications out there that you could explore as well. But just within expeditions as an app, there's so many different things we can explore and learn from. So it should be quite cool. So that was the Google Expeditions for VR, and we looked at a cities example, New York here as an example. And that was just one of the expeditions. There are others. I'm now going to switch into AR and show you a little bit how that works. And maybe that's supported on your phone. And please feel free to critique AR or VR experiences. I do think my feedback is a little bit different. It's very much focused on the environment and how it works with placing objects in the physical environment, anchoring. And I noticed quite a few issues around rotation and scaling, which wasn't really supported. Only some kind of translation along the y-axis. That was a little confusing to me. But let's look at this together. It's a think aloud, again, from my perspective. This critique could be reformulated into the I like, I wish, what if method. I would still go and do a think aloud first of any interface that somebody wants you to try out. And then you should summarize your feedback in this I like, I wish, and what if method. We're going to view it in AR. And so here we're going to put it on the floor. This is a skeletal system. And let's look at this guy, pretty big. Yeah, he doesn't look too happy. And just looking at the skull. And that is interesting how it's animated and basically goes apart. Yeah. And then the spine. It's a bit scary, isn't it? And in this case we're going to raise it a little bit, but it should be scaled. Okay. So the AR interactions overall are pretty limited. Expeditions, again, is designed in an interesting way. It's for a classroom use, so you might actually run this in a classroom, so with a set of students and learners. And maybe that is why there is no audio, so that we don't actually have the audio really interfering. That could be a design decision. It was just not really explicitly communicated. And so that's fine. So again, keep in mind that not all of the criticism might be valid here. This is just like based on this one use case of me trying it out in the studio, or you trying it out at home or wherever you are. And consider the fact that it was designed for classroom use, and it actually has a mode where an instructor could use it with a group of students. And that's something to experience as well. And so to close, I would like to highlight a few key points again. We should really try to base our critiques on established design guidelines, and that makes them more objective, and that's just a very good way to critique. So obviously design guidelines could be based on design principles, so like Norman principles of design, feedback, affordances, mappings, and constraints, whether something follows natural mappings, and whether the affordances, physical affordances, or whether the objects suggest to you how you can interact with them, and constraints as well. You should take into account usability, so learnability, memorability, efficiency, errors, and satisfaction. These are common usability considerations. You should also critique it from the perspective of accessibility and equity. So if an interface uses some of the most advanced features out there that are probably only available on the latest generation headsets, which at this stage are still very expensive, think about whether that is really necessary, and think about the limited reach, because a lot of people may not be able to afford that experience. And that's another thing that I like about Google Expeditions, that it's designed for low-end devices and therefore scales also in the classroom potentially. Think about the audience, so the users, their background, again bring in this idea of personas, and maybe review from that perspective. And then also, to a limited extent I would say, bring in your personal experience. And finally, you should think about some of the broader concerns that you may have about the experience and the impact that it may have on its users. Here I'm just going to list a few of the common ones. So privacy is a big concern, mental health, physical health, anything that you think has to do with ethical issues. So maybe the degree and the level of realism, and maybe the level of immersion, and whether this could be potentially dangerous. Think about the social impact. Can this experience be used in a classroom or not? Think about those kinds of things. Think about cultural issues that you see in the design. So if I just use sports metaphors from baseball, I would understand nothing. And so it's one of the issues I had when I came to the US, but just a side note here. And any kind of environmental and sustainability concerns. So really be broad also in your review, and address those and bring up those concerns. Just raise them. Can lead to very interesting discussions. Welcome to the honors track of the User Experience and Interaction Design course. Now this is the track where we're really going to get our hands dirty. I've been talking about getting our hands dirty, but so far we've been mostly going through the concepts and the lecture contents, and I've introduced you to all the key topics. But this is really the track where we're going to work on some of the things. In fact, we're going to develop our first, for many of us it will be our first AR, VR project. So we're going to take a design perspective, okay? So what you will not be a Unity or Unreal or A-frame WebXR expert at the end of this. No, I think of this honors track as the beginning of, well, a longer track that leads into the third course. The third course is more focused on development. So in this course, we're really going to start with storyboarding, actually design critiques first, okay? First, you need to pick a problem, and I'm thinking to start from an existing project, to start from an existing example, that allows us to learn. I also thought about how can I streamline this a little bit so that, you know, in my residential program we have like weeks of developing a project, but I was thinking this is an online learning experience, and so you may not have that much time. So I wanted to scope it down a little bit. So I'll walk you through some of these ideas that I have, and I'll also show you how I've worked on some of these exercises myself. In fact, I've actually done the project. I had a lot of fun, rearranged everything here, so I'll show you what I've been up to. So let's quickly start with the organizational things. So you know, this is where you are in the course. You are kind of like in this week now, design thinking. This is where I welcome you to the honors track. And here we have honors track content, and I'm going to walk you through each of these steps, and these are some of the things that ultimately actually lead up to a project. It's actually really cool. Again, as I said, it's the design part, but ending with a digital prototype. And so this is quite cool. So this is the honors track, now horizontally. And we're going to do a design critique. We're going to do storyboarding and wireframing. Based on an existing app, we're going to try to exercise these activities, but also introducing perhaps one new idea. That's like one new feature that you can implement, but I thought it's a very good way for us to learn about each of the methods. When we don't make the primary issue to come up with a really compelling idea for an AR/VR project, because you can spend ages on that. As I talk about in problem framing and my brainstorming lectures. So I wanted to remove this from the honors track and really focus more on practicing the skills. You are allowed to do your project, but this is a recommendation. So we're going to start with a design critique, and we're going to look at in Google Expeditions like, and I say Google Expeditions like XR app. So Google Expeditions is interesting because it's like an app you can download for your phone, and it has AR and VR modes, so it comes like for each of these platforms. It runs on a variety of smartphones, so it's actually quite a good example for us to learn from. And we're going to look at it and we're going to critique it. And so doing a design critique is one of the first things you'll be doing. And you're going to do it both from a guidelines perspective, so practicing this, and then also from an ethics perspective, because design ethics is really, really important. And so think about what this would be like if you were to use this Google Expedition in a public setting as opposed to a private setting. or what it would be like to use it in a private setting. And are you concerned about the data that it collects, and what kind of data does it actually collect anyway? So we're going to do storyboarding because our idea is, first of all, to understand the flow of the app and then also come up with a new idea. And in fact, storyboarding will allow us to brainstorm. We're going to create wireframes on the way, and we're going to do it in a variety of, well, fidelities or techniques, if you will. We start on paper. We'll explore a little bit the 360 templates that I was talking about, or will be talking about, depending on where you are in the course. And then the 3D, we're going to do 3D storyboard. If you want, I went into Tilt Brush, and maybe you're going to choose a similar tool. We're going to do physical prototyping. So we start on paper, and then we're going to again introduce 360 templates. And this way we're going to do it for real, like wireframes, and then really figuring out the environment. And then we're going to do 3D modeling, but we do it with clay or some kind of Play-Doh, if you will. I would recommend not to use Play-Doh because Play-Doh hardens, and so there's other kinds of clay out there. But I mean, I initially started working, when I worked on Proto-AR, I worked with Play-Doh, and you can preserve it for up to a year and then it dies. That's a little bit unfortunate. We're also going to build a diorama. So we're going to actually, I'll show you what I did, and I probably went a little bit overboard, but I wanted to look professional on video. So normally in the classroom, we just make anything and everything a diorama. It can just happen on a table. You repurpose your Amazon cardboard boxes and wherever you order from, and turn it into a stage. We're going to do digital prototyping, both for VR and AR. In fact, we're going to do digital prototyping, I say here, but we're also going to do immersive authoring. So that means actually directly working in VR and also in AR. I'm going to show you examples of each of these. So that's a lot, right? Yeah, I know. Yeah, I can tell from experience, it is a lot. And well, the thing is, you can pick the things that you want to learn about the most. I think each of these, you don't actually have to do all of them. Like in a normal project, I wouldn't like do each and every one of them. Like I wouldn't do four different types of storyboards. I would just like do a storyboard, maybe start on paper, and then maybe jump into a 360 template if that allows me. But then I'll move on quickly and make it a physical prototype. So I did it like picture book style, like really each of these so that you get examples. But try to abstract a little bit from that and not suggest that this is really how you should do the process. The process is really like figuring out, we have all these options and where do they fit into the larger scheme. So in the following, I'm going to show you a video of me going through a significant subset of each of these exercises. I don't show the design critique, but I focus on storyboarding, physical prototyping, and then various types of digital prototyping for both VR and AR. And I've done it, and it was a lot of fun. I can't say it looks like super nice, but it was just enough for me to learn about the requirements. And I got so many different ideas along the way. I'm not sure I actually really followed each of them through, so don't judge me. I was more focused on trying to capture this stuff in the right way for you. If you wanted to really see how Michael works on these kinds of projects, you would have to come and join my lab. It's pretty chaotic, but usually also quite productive, and in the end, most of the time even successful. But I don't know, we just want to experiment and try out these things. So the honest track is hopefully really something that you're as excited about as I am. So here is my video summary. So you'll see me initially. I'll start wireframing and storyboarding, and then I go back to the app and I'm like trying to get some ideas. I've already at this stage sketched out quite a few things, and then I feel like, hang on, you can only view one planet at a time. So I was focused on the solar system. So I actually go through it in my head, and I'm like, and not just in my head, but on paper, because that's the whole point of the exercise. And I storyboard on paper, and I understand the flow between some of these screens. And then I take this storyboard further. This is one of the versions, in fact version 4B that I've created, of a 360 storyboard here. So I've really sketching out the scene, I've been sketching out the scene, and I've been even thinking about where the light should be coming from and where shadows are. And I wanted the planets to appear next to each other and not just one planet at a time. And so I'm like thinking this through, and then I'm jumping into this 360 view and really experimenting with, hey, this looks actually quite cool. Obviously, this template is tricky sometimes, so I'm not sure that every single idea you have will work or view well. So, you know, but it kind of works. And then I went into immersive authoring here with Tiltbrush and actually had quite a bit of fun. For many of these steps of exercises, I actually have the full videos for you to help you guide through some of them. Sometimes I just show a time lapse because it was a 50-minute video, so it's going to take forever for you to watch otherwise, but I share. Here I'm actually thinking through my VR prototype and different scenes. I've sketched them out next to each other. I have a few tips of how to use Tiltbrush for storyboarding. And then this is one of these time-lapse examples where I was actually then starting to sketch out the screens and really getting a sense for the interactions and actually the content. At this stage I was really thinking a lot about content, and then once I had some basic content to work with, I cut it out and I gave it some flexibility, and I was exploring different kinds of planet movements and transitions. And then I used those, the ones that I had just cut out, and put them on toothpicks, and then I placed them above the 360 template, and then I played around with different kinds of compositions. And then I felt like my planets look pretty ugly, so let's find some photos and print them out and cut them out and look what that looks like. And then I started, well, this is the creative part now, where I really start playing with Play-Doh, and I'm exploring different kinds of compositions here. So once I have all my planets, say, how is the moon going to move? Wouldn't it look cool if the moon were going around Earth and you could still see the sun in the background? So I was like really playing around a little bit, and pay attention to how I use my smartphone. It's not always, it's sometimes just a capture device. And here I'm building towards, I'm going a few steps towards the diorama. And then I just captured one of my prototypes above a white template. So after trying out these things in my tool, I went to a couple of tools that I can use on my iPad. I played around with both Apple Reality Composer and Adobe Aero. This is one of them. And I'm just using abstract shapes here. But I'm doing it immersively, so it's like really placed here in AR, and I'm playing around with how users might explore this, what kinds of compositions could be interesting. At this stage I was really focused on the content still, and not so much the interactions. But then I went into VR. Here I'm using blocks, and I'm actually creating recreating some of my compositions, and then I'm also thinking about how these interactions could work. And I can just grab these planets and like have them rotate, like this is the moon rotating around Earth, and I can just do it this way. And finally, I'll share an A-frame version of this that we have created, a few students of mine and myself actually. And this is the result of it. And you can run it in VR and in AR. Here I'm showing it in the Oculus. And then we're going to go on an Android phone using AR Core. And here, so it's running in a web browser, just to be clear, but it's still using AR Core. It's markerless AR. And then you can see this world. And I'm talking about some of the modifications I had to make. So for example, get rid of the particle system that I was using to have stars in the background. Just performance was pretty bad otherwise. But overall it looks quite nice. And in the end I even put it in Cardboard. In Google Cardboard I could then, just to, you know, make sure that if you don't have the latest and greatest VR equipment, this is something you should be able to do with your smartphone. And get like a stereoscopic viewer that you can attach to your smartphone and turn it into like something like Google Cardboard and turn it into a VR display. So because there was a lot of stuff going on in the video, I'm going to just quickly summarize. These are the key steps that you'll be working on, and we do a little bit of a slideshow here. So you're going to start from a design critique. You can choose any expedition you like. I chose the solar system. You do a storyboard and you use the app and that guides your thinking, and actually you sketch out the existing flows, and then you start thinking about new ideas. And here's my new idea. I'm not going to explain it now, and that is that. But then I was taking this idea further and going into this 360 storyboard and previewing it, so that's something you'll do as well. I also then created a 3D storyboard, as I said, so really using immersive authoring, but still for storyboarding. And this is what this looks like. I created a paper prototype, I then cut out the things. I destroyed my paper prototype, but this is what I often do when it comes to AR/VR prototyping, because you want to have more flexibility and use your phone. So rather than sketching the phone, you just use your phone, and then you turn your little table into a stage and you start acting and recording some of these interactions. I then also did it above the 360 template, and that allowed me to get this, a sense of the scale of the experience, and also really what it looks like in an environment. And keep in mind, I was doing an AR expedition, so I'm using all these tools. So don't just think black and white. A lot of these tools can be used between modalities, and doing Play-Doh here, becoming physical, trying out different kinds of compositions. So Play-Doh for my 3D models, and then I put up this diorama. In the end, I didn't make the best use of this, I must say, but it looks cool. And I was exploring different kinds of compositions, and this white background is very useful for the AR camera that I'm using here. In this screenshot, keep in mind that the sun in the background, this lollipop there, that is actually a physical object. And the Earth and the Moon, those two in the front here, they are actually captured from paper, but they are projected with AR. So I'm using a composition of AR objects and then some physical objects to just try to understand some of the relationships between them. And so that's something that I wanted to develop, this kind of like creativity that is necessary to be a good designer. And here we then go into AR and immersive authoring. And there's a variety of tools out there. Most of the tools that I was using were for free. Google Tilt Brush is one that is not for free. Might be worth it if you want to play around with it, 3D sketching. But here's Blocks, and Blocks is for free. And actually Blocks is the better tool for a lot of the assets. So if I did something slightly more advanced than placing 3D spheres in midair, this might actually be a cool starting point as an asset. You can download it. I show how this can be downloaded. And then later in the courses, you will learn about embedding 3D models. And then here's my final VR scene. So I'm jumping in there with the Oculus. And then I'm also talking it through. So you can find those in the last week when it comes to digital prototyping and immersive authoring. And here I'll do my final AR. And I have it running in this very room. Cool. This is, well, I don't know. I hope somebody watches this. I hope somebody really does these exercises. I would really like to talk to you if you have questions or concerns, if something in my instructions isn't clear. I was hoping that with all these examples, actually going through it myself, it was kind of like beta testing, and I think it makes sense. But, well, don't hesitate to reach out and help yourselves and help each others, right? So help each other. We are here together to learn together. And if you are a student in my residential course, this will be one of the first exercises that I'll share with you and that I want you to work on. And I think it's a good start. And then after that can come your own ideas, but that's a separate issue, okay? Coming up with a really cool idea and learning about the methods, you don't have to do both. That's why we're doing it the way that I have set it up here. So enjoy and let me know if there's anything that's not clear. Again, welcome to the honors track. This is the XR design critique. This is the exercise that is going to get us started as part of the honors track. So for every exercise, I'll provide a little introduction video. The specific instructions regarding the exercise will be shared through the MOOC, the readings that we have. But this video provides an overview and talks about some of the main steps and why this exercise actually exists. So, design critiques are very important. I'll talk about that in its dedicated lecture. It's a ritual. In fact, in my course, when I teach this residentially, every student has to critique an existing AR/VR app, and it's really cool because when you bring together all these students and they critique these existing apps, everybody learns about existing apps, and also we practice our skills of doing a thoughtful, productive, but also with constructive criticism, a rich critique, something that we can learn from. And so that's what we're trying to exercise here. So I'm going to walk you through the main steps of this exercise. So the task, should you choose to accept it, is to critique an existing expedition like XR app in 360 VR or AR. So I say this so that we have maximum flexibility. You don't necessarily have to have VR or AR. You can just do it on a smartphone with 360. So, and I say expedition like XR app. I'm thinking Google Expedition, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Google Expedition in a second. But also, it could be your favorite museum if it has an app, or something for the city, or something that feels like you can go on a tour. I want it to be not too complex an app, but the activity is really to critique it. And if it's too complex, it might probably be one of the main criticisms. So, what I'm thinking in the task should be to record yourself describing the XR experience using Think Aloud. It's very important. So the Think Aloud part is really important. Yeah, you should play around with it, and then you play around with it one more time, and then you record what you're thinking. Even your most often the first time impressions are really the ones that are really cool to capture in this Think Aloud. But maybe we're not used to this idea of thinking aloud as we're using something, and that's something you have to practice. And I'll show you an example of me doing a Think Aloud while playing around with an existing Google Expedition. I chose the solar system one. I want you to describe the context of your XR experience. So I want you to, well, basically share, when you share the results of your critique, whether you have operated this app in 360, in VR, in AR, have you been in a private or public setting. So if you were, you don't have to be too specific. But I think it may have impact on how you critique the app. Maybe it was not designed for the context in which you used it. And so that's then something that we could also discuss as well. I want you to critique the expedition using the template, the I like, I wish, what if template, okay? So I introduced it in the lecture, and I'm gonna briefly mention it again in the next few slides. I want you to analyze the expedition in terms of guidelines. So really design guidelines first, and I provided some examples of guidelines. I mean, as you know from my lecture, I'm never really happy with all the guidelines we have. We don't have enough guidelines, and those we have are not good enough. So anyway, this is a starting point. I want you to also articulate ethical, social, or privacy concerns one might have. I mean, you might have them, you might not have them, but users could have them, and so I want you to think about that. So the expected results of this activity and this exercise are that you have now provided a balanced critique of positive and negative design aspects. So really start with the positive, remember. You have developed initial ideas for how to change and improve the design. That will be very helpful for you as you're continuing to work on this and go into the next stage, which is storyboarding. And as part of storyboarding, we do brainstorming. And you also have a better sense of what to look for in terms of design guidelines. So that would make me really happy if we achieved all these, if these were really truly the results. So that would be cool. But that's what I'm hoping we get out of this. And if you practice critiques and you really think broadly about some of the concerns, then I think this will be very valuable and might be a lot of fun to also discuss with your peer learners here. So please, we'll have forums available and we can chat. So I said the expedition that I had in mind, the actual app is Google Expeditions. So now Google Expeditions comes in VR and in AR, and it's actually popular in classroom environments. So Google is targeting education scenarios, and I thought this is a good app for us. But I say expedition-like. It could be really anything, but I don't want it to be too complicated. Ideally, it's publicly available so that others can actually also try it out. So you should be clear how you obtained the app if it wasn't Google Expeditions. So here's an example of me running the World Cities Expedition, and I've covered that in the lecture. And here is a video of me trying it out, actually here in the studio, the solar system app. All right, I'm going to do a design crit, an XR design crit of the Google Expeditions, the exploring the solar system, and we're going to start it in AR. So initially, I think this works quite well. Detects the surface okay, and then the problem is that the planet is like really, really big that we're getting. And any attempt to resize doesn't work. I can just raise it, but I have not figured out a way to resize or rotate. And that is actually something that I would normally expect from an app. Then you can learn more about the sun, and what we're going to do instead is we're going to look at Earth. So Earth is obviously smaller than the sun, but it's still definitely quite big. And same issue, but I do like the inner planets. So that's like kind of cool when they then appear above the keyboard here. So there's Earth, and we can look at some of the detail, maybe even find parts. Well, maybe you can find where you live, and that could be interesting. And tracking works. Tracking is really robust, obviously, so that's kind of nice. And then the moon, again, a monster. Boom! And it's just massive. And we have the outer planets. So that's also pretty cool. And so it would be nice to have labels on these. I really like the look of the planets, but like having labels would be very useful. And so that you're actually learning something. I mean, right now it's kind of cool. The asteroid belt. It kind of looks cool and nice. The dwarf planets. But then you would really want to learn a little bit more. And the interactions here are definitely pretty limited. It does look cool though. I must admit that. So I would say I like the look of the planets. That's pretty cool. And I like how, I especially like the inner planets. And I like how they've broken down the solar system. Although it's harder for me to build the relationships between the different kinds of views that I have on the different planets and the asteroid belt and the moon's normally obviously going around Earth, so would have been nice to see that. I wished I were able to rescale, resize. So this, I just don't understand why I would want to raise it like crazy. It does make sense when I put it on, when I relocate it, but I also can't relocate it. So I don't know how to do that. Can send feedback. Yeah, so what if you were allowing me to scale it once, and then also, like, I think the other thing is the distance. When I then switch, I'm sure it's gonna just be again. Oh, it does keep in mind what I wanted in terms of distance. Oh, it does. It does not rotate and scale. So that's really my biggest complaint here. And so here is what you just saw, at least a subset of it. And these are all the screens. So this is the download screen, obviously. Then you enter it, you place it. I didn't have a screenshot for the placing part. And then once you have placed it, you have like this card interface down there. And this edge is really, really key. It suggests that there is more. So you swipe to the left and then you get to see Earth. You can swipe up and you get to see some of the information about Earth. And then you swipe to the left again, you bring up this screen and so forth. And this is how the Expedition works. And I want you to critique the Expedition app, the Expedition-like app that you chose. I want you to use the I like, I wish, what if template. So what you like about it, important to start with something positive. And there should be two positives, okay? What could be improved? And here really try to be specific, try to be objective, not subjective. And what could be improved is one thing, but how would you improve it? How could it be improved? This is really the hard part. This is what we're after here. This will help us develop some new ideas as we are going to improve upon the app. So here are some examples. The look of the planets, that's pretty cool. I think that's something I said in the video. How they have broken down the solar system is something that I liked. I could resize and rotate the planets. I really wished I could. And I could better understand the relationships between planets. It was really just not enough. Like the scale was really unclear. I could adjust the scale and rotation using pinch to zoom. Yeah, that was really confusing to me. I remember the going up and down part. That was weird. Like, why does it only change around the Y? And so how would I improve it? Well, using pinch to zoom, for example, which is a very common gesture. And how could I adjust the distance to the planets? And then the other idea is to adjust the distance to the plane using drag and drop. So that was referring to the fact that once the expedition was placed, I basically had to restart the app. I couldn't figure out how to move it to a different plane. Maybe it is somewhere in the app and I just didn't notice, but then we need to improve upon that aspect. That is called bad usability. If people cannot discover what you can do with the app, then yeah, we have a problem. So this was a review based on the design guidelines using the I like, I wish, what if template. The next thing I want you to do is also to perform an ethics review. And I was talking about design ethics review as part of the XR design ethics lecture. And I was describing these 4 main steps or considerations as part of the review. So the context and situation, the sensory information and data, the processing pipeline, as much as you understand it. I mean, clearly you will not have developed the app, but maybe you are developing an intuition for what goes on behind the scenes, or the app informs you. And this informing part in terms of terms and what you consent to, this is also really key that we want to look at for data ownership and governance. So in my example, that would be that I was using the AR version in the studio here. I was actually the only user in the device vicinity. I mean, my bunny was probably in the background, but we don't know. The sensory information, well, it sees mostly me. It sees the furniture. It does see expensive equipment here. Keep in mind that this equipment is on loan from the University of Michigan, so this is not my own equipment. The surface area of the table and the floor. So altogether, you can obviously you can actually make some sense of this information both for tracking and registration, but then also maybe in a negative way. And so that goes more under the ethics part, obviously. The processing pipelines, I think it's a pretty naive application. It does standard surface detection, doesn't do a lot with spatial mesh. In fact, it doesn't have a spatial mesh. There's no scene understanding. It may build anonymous usage statistics. I don't know about that, but it keeps a library. It keeps track of the different kinds of expeditions I was downloading. There is a teacher mode, which I think is a bit more advanced and multi-user, and that has potentially a more complex processing pipeline and actually will raise additional concerns. Expeditions app manages the downloads, as I was just talking about. There's this library tab. So that's the kind of information that I know. I don't know what they collect, and I also don't know, because these expeditions were actually developed independently. So there are some Google ones, but there are also ones developed by others. It would be interesting to understand the expeditions framework a little bit better and understand what kind of data is actually being collected and shared with those third-party vendors. That's it, right? So we're going to learn a lot about ethics by actually thinking it through, but we're also going to do a design critique more broadly, thinking obviously also about the social and ethical concerns as I was just talking about, but also thinking a lot about the design and design guidelines. And so pay attention to whether you're doing an AR or a VR expedition or something in between, like 360. Share that with us and fellow learners so that we actually understand your critique better. Let us know how and where you used it and what you found confusing. And well, we should get a first indication of the kinds of things you think you would be improving as you keep working in this honest track on the next steps, which would then be storyboarding and wireframing, really brainstorming new ideas and fleshing them out.